A Warlock in Whitby, the second in the Whitby trilogy, by Robin Jarvis, read by Sean Phillips. Whitby slept. The autumn darkness in which it cosily huddled was calm and still. A mild breeze stirred the midnight waters of the harbour. Save for the drugged, murmuring voice of the sea, Whitby was silent. Up on the east cliff, the silhouette of the abbey challenged the domain of the frosty moon. Between broken pillars and gaping windows, the soft breeze moved, stroking the weathered walls, whose stones had become charged with the power that dwells in all ancient things. Before the breeze, wild grasses bowed. Yet beneath the swaying heads, the sleep of uncounted years was finally coming to an end. Presently the soil began to pulse as if it were alive. Then the grass parted as its thick tangle of roots stretched and ripped apart. Into the cold night a hideous claw emerged. The silver moonlight glistened on the barbed hooks as they tore away the soil. Soon a pale, scale-covered arm reached up and thrashed wildly at the ground. Up, up, out of the suffocating earth it came, worming and pushing, until at last it was able to haul itself from the pit. A vile, misshapen creature threw its humpbacked body upon the grass, gargling a mixture of phlegm and soil. It sprang to its deformed and webbed feet, the stumpy legs trembling unsteadily. Two large, round eyes stared out from the head, glowing with the sickly luminescence of those who dwell in the deepmost regions of the ocean. They blinked, and 3 rows of needle-like teeth were bared and ground together. The fish demon, last of the savage malekin race, whirled about and beheld for the first time in over 1,000 years the estuary of the river Esk. A horrible gurgle issued from the creature's throat as it pattered forward for a better view. The reeking species of mankind had smothered the land, and the fin on the top of its head fanned open as it hissed its hatred. Miserably and with a waddling hop, it hurried from the grievous sight. Suddenly it froze. It was not alone upon the abbey plain. Amongst the grasses some other creature was prowling. The malekin could sense the rapid beating of a tiny heart. With a frightful yell, the fish demon leapt forward. Then the creature disappeared into the night to devour the still wriggling meal in some darker, less open place. With a gentle shudder, the morning train slid into the town. After they had barged and hurried out of the train, the passengers alighted and set off towards the barrier. But not all hurried down the platform. In one of the carriages, a single figure remained. With deliberate slowness, the man stepped from the train. He was a dark-haired man, with a wiry, unkempt beard that framed his sunburned face. His eyes were like pieces of midnight, jewels of darkness in which no glint of day ever shone. Alone on the platform, the man delved into the pocket of his tatty jacket and brought out a slim gold case. Taking a cigarette, he struck a match and cupped his hands round his mouth. Deep he drew on the cigarette. A difficult and dangerous trail lay ahead. He knew that the next few days were to be the greatest test of his cunning and endurance. He moved to return the cigarette case to his pocket. In the bright sunshine, the words engraved on the gold flowed up into his face. To my darling Nathaniel, obediently yours, Rosalind. For a fraction of a second, his face was a distorted vision of evil and cruelty, and a cold chuckle resounded in his throat. Nathaniel Crozier, historian, philanderer, warlock, and high priest of the Black Scepter, the widower of the late Rowena Cooper, had arrived in Whitby at last. Missing Cat's Mystery, read the headline of the Gazette. Since the beginning of October, many pets had disappeared. The popular theory of the moment was that an unscrupulous furrier was to blame. Cat owners had become extremely careful when they put their loved ones out at night. Some even tied them to long pieces of string to prevent them straying too far. Perhaps it was this concern for the well-being of the family pet that first started it all. One thing was certainly true, however. Whitby had changed. Over both the West Cliff and the East there was a brooding tension, and a general sense of anxiety filled the hearts of everyone. Mrs. Gregson picked up the visitor's luggage and toiled up the stairs with it. On the landing she pushed open a door and showed him into the bedroom beyond. Nathaniel Crozier brushed past her and strode to the window. "Not a very good view, I'm afraid," she said, wringing her hands. "The cliff rises so steep at the back of the garden. You can't see a thing other than what next door are doing in this." The man stared down out of the window. Mrs. Gregson was quite right. You could see into the garden next door. He grinned to himself, for there, with a trowel in her hand, busily digging the weeds from a herbaceous border, was a white-haired old woman. "Excellent," he whispered. "The room is most satisfactory. I shall be perfectly happy here." When Nathaniel set out to climb the 199 steps which scaled the cliff, it was getting on for 2 o'clock. At the summit he paused. "Oh, Rosalind," he said quietly, "why did you try to break free? It was my skill which released your true nature, my fine, dark death hound." He tutted at the bustling streets below. How he loathed such places. "How could anyone in this seedy backwater have vanquished you?" he breathed. "What was it that caught you unawares? Who was it?" Silently he turned from the scene, the bleak November wind coursing through his hair. Surely he wasn't feeling grief at Rosalind's demise. It was an unusual sensation, and it surprised him, until, of course, he realized that what he felt was annoyance. She had been useful, and to find a suitable replacement would take valuable time. Shrugging off this pensive mood, he made for the next target on his itinerary. The derelict house was ugly and shabby. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. Nathaniel examined the rotting gate and read the name. The Hawthorns. This was the place. Here his wife, under the alias Rowena Cooper, had lived, but the spell she had woven over the fabric of the building had perished with her, and it had fallen back into its grim slovenliness. Maybe here there would be a clue as to what had happened to her. Nathaniel hesitated. From around the corner of the house, an old lady appeared. A ghost of a smile twitched over Nathaniel's face. It was the Gregsons' neighbor. He had not expected to meet her quite so soon. Alice Boston, a blustering 92-year-old, marched up the weed-throttled pathway. She was a comical sight. A sage-green tweed cloak was draped around her shoulders, and upon her woolly head, perched at a precarious angle and covered in cobwebs, was a shapeless brown hat. Nathaniel watched with some amusement as she drew near, and then said, "Is this your house?" Miss Boston looked horrified at the suggestion. "Heavens, no," she declared, puckering her face up at the very idea. "I live just off Church Street." She realized how it must look to him. "Forgive me," she cried. "I understand now. You must be wondering what I was doing in there." "I have to confess a certain amount of curiosity," he replied. "Why would anyone like you go crawling through the dirt in such a wretched place as this?" "Oh, Eurydice," she said, as if that explained everything. "Confounded animal." From the folds of her cloak she brought out a disgruntled-looking cat which only possessed 3 legs. "Always taking off and scuttling to this hideous ruin." I don't suppose anyone has lived here for many years, observed Nathaniel. On the contrary, she fiercely corrected. Only 2 months ago it was inhabited. Why, I even had afternoon tea there. Then what could have happened in 2 months to bring it to this sorry state? I doubt if you would believe me, young man. You'd only think I was a dotty old woman imagining things. Nathaniel turned the power of his smile on her. I'm not that young, he began. And you're not that old. Miss Boston clucked like a happy chicken. Oh, well, she said, the last owner of the house was not all she pretended to be. I could tell you a few tales about that one which would curl your hair. Never has Whitby been host to a more evil person. She almost destroyed everything. The old lady's face changed, and an expression of fear and dread stole over her. She remembered that dark time. What became of this person? Asked Nathaniel softly. She died. How? The tower. It collapsed. Explain. Miss Boston stared up at the man. Why was he so interested in Rowena Cooper? A terrible drowsiness began to creep into the old lady's muscles, and he demanded once more that she tell him. I tricked her, maneuvered her backwards in time, to a point when... Suddenly the cat began to struggle again, and one of its claws snagged Miss Boston's skin. It was like a pin bursting a bubble. Nathaniel's control was banished from her mind as the pain raked down her arm. The old lady shook herself and shivered, wondering what it was that she had been about to say. Why had she been so careless? How could she have spoken to a total stranger about those matters? I'm terribly sorry, she said, rubbing her arm. I must get back home. The children will be out of school soon and wanting their tea. Excuse me. Nathaniel opened the gate. No doubt we shall meet again, he told her. Miss Boston slipped by him. Her gabbling tongue had unsettled her, and she had grown suspicious of this charming stranger. All she wanted to do was get away from him in case she let anything else slip. I'm afraid we probably can't, she declared. Not for a while, anyway. Oh, bother! Her cloak had snagged on a nail, and she fumbled with it in agitation. It would seem the house is reluctant to let you leave, he laughed. Oh, devil take the house, fumed Miss Boston, and devil take this gate, because I am leaving. Leaving Whitby, as a matter of fact. There. Oh, blow, it's made a little hole. Leaving Whitby, Nathaniel murmured. For good? Miss Boston stared at him. What did she have to go and tell him that for? No, she said with caution. I shall only be gone for about a week. Tomorrow I leave for London. An old friend of mine is ill, you see, she found herself saying. Not expected to survive the week. Poor Patricia. Such a waste. She clicked her tongue as if switching the troublesome instrument off, then gave Nathaniel a nod and set off down the lane, hitching Eurydice under her arm. The man turned back to the house and frowned. By the shore, the failing daylight glimmered over the moving waters, and long shadows stretched down the sand. Upon one of the boulders, a solitary figure sat gazing out to the darkening horizon, where sea met sky. Nelda's eyes remained fixed upon that distant rim until it was too dark to see, even for an Aufwader. Eventually she covered her face with her hands and sighed. She was a strange-looking creature, youngest of the sole surviving tribe of fisherfolk who dwelt in caves under the cliffs of Whitby. Her face was as wrinkled and weathered as any human of advanced years, yet to the rest of her people she was merely a child. She knew what it was like to be alone, for there were no others of the Aufwader race her age, and there never would be. The females of the tribe were cursed. They either died carrying the unborn child or perished with the infant at birth. Such was the terrible punishment of the mighty lords of the deep, who reigned in the fathomless reaches of the ocean, and so the numbers of the outwaders dwindled and decreased over long, barren years. "Oi!" came a voice from behind her. "Nelda!" The outwader looked over her shoulder. A human boy was running across the sands towards her. She made room on the boulder and waited for him. "I wasn't sure if you'd be here," Ben cried when he drew near. "Haven't seen you for weeks." "There's been much to attend to." Nelda swept the hat from her head and rubbed her tangled hair. "But take care, Ben," she began. "You must not hail me so loudly. What if another were to hear you? Unless they are blessed with the sight as you are, they would think you're crazed." "I don't care," he said. "What if nobody else can see you? I can, and that's all that matters. Do you know, I've been here every day after school looking for you." Her face creased into a warm grin. "Have you truly?" she asked. "Yes. I even thought of shouting your name outside the hidden entrance, but I didn't want to get you into trouble with the elders." Nelda shuddered. "Then I thank you for not doing so," she said quickly. "I have no wish to anger the triad." "What's wrong?" "Me," she replied. "I fear for myself." "Can't I help?" "Not this time. No. I must face this alone." A gull flew overhead and Nelda paused to watch it soar over the cliff. "Listen to me, Ben. Hear me now, lest I am unable to tell you in later times. You have been a true friend. In the short time I've known you, you've done nothing but try to aid both me and the tribe. Never shall I forget your bravery in the search for the moon kelp." Ben shook his head. "What are you trying to tell me?" he interrupted. Nelda took his hand. "My heart foretells our meetings will end. The two races of man and outwader will be sundered forever. We shall not set eyes on each other again, not till the seas are lost and the bones of the land broken." "I don't understand," he mumbled. "Why can't we go on meeting? Has someone forbidden it?" But she was looking up at the sky. It had grown dark. "I must return," she said quietly, "back to whatever doom lies in wait. Look for me, Ben, here at this time when the sun is low. If I am at liberty to come, I shall." And with that she hurried over the rocks and disappeared round the cliff. Ben knew she had gone to one of the secret entrances which led to the Aufwader tunnels. He felt miserable. "Nelda," he feebly called after her. "Nelda!" The passage was dark and narrow. This was one of the oldest of all routes to the Aufwader caves. Only Nelda now used this tunnel, and she considered it to be her very own, somewhere secluded to escape to when life grew unbearable. An hour had passed since she had said farewell to Ben, but she had not yet had the courage to return to the tribe. Slowly she rocked back and forth, her head resting in her hands. A great burden lay heavily on her spirit, and she was at a loss to know how to escape what must come. Then Nelda rose, and through the empty tunnels which connected the main halls, she slowly wound her way. It was not long before she realized that something was wrong. Although she could hear the usual sound of crackling fires, and the scent of steaming broth tantalized her nostrils, there was nothing else. With mounting concern, she shouted, "Hello!" But all she heard was the echo of her own voice ringing through the tunnels. Hastily, Nelda ran the rest of the way to her family's quarters, anxious and afraid. When she reached the low entrance, she took a deep breath, threw back the cloth, and stepped inside it. It was horribly cold, and the lamp was not lit. But Nelda could discern a figure, hunched and still, staring into the charred remains of yesterday's fire, as if waiting for some oracle to speak from the cinders. When Nelda entered, he lifted his head. "Grandfather!" she cried. "What is it? Where is everyone?" Tar reached for the staff which lay at his side and hauled himself from the rushy floor. lass. I wish thou hadna come back." The old Aufwader rushed towards his granddaughter and caught her in a desperate embrace. And then Nelda knew. All those weeks of doubt and uncertainty were finally confirmed. "The summons bell has been rung," she said. "That is why they are all absent." Tears were running down Tar's ancient brown face. "There was naught I could do," he sobbed. "Naught. Deeps take me if I didn't do all I could, but there's naught to be done." Slowly Nelda pulled away from him. "Grandfather," she began in a wavering voice, "a part of me has died this night. Inside, I am numb." "Then I'll weep for us both," he answered huskily. "Come, lass." He held out his rough, calloused hand, and she took it in her own. Down the dim labyrinths of tunnels they made their way. Nelda knew where they were headed. Nothing could release her from the fate which was waiting. Deeper under the cliff the two fisherfolk went, down the steep osial stair to the gibbering road. This was a slender bridge of stone that stretched across a wide chasm. It was said that the gaping gulf it spanned was bottomless, and contained the tormented souls of those drowned at sea. On stormy nights you could hear the hollow voices wailing in anguish. In single file they began to cross, with Tar leading the way. As Nelda stepped onto the perilous bridge, she happened to look down. It was a mistake. The world fell away, and the blackness below was so impenetrable it seemed to have a substance all its own. With her heart fluttering in her breast, Nelda hurried across and seized Tar's hand once again. They were getting close to the ancient heart of the Aufwader realm. Nelda stared about her as they came to a huge cavern, larger than any she had ever seen. It was filled with stalagmites that towered up to the dripping ceiling, forming immense natural pillars of glistening rock. Underground springs foamed along deep channels worn into the floor, and waterfalls cascaded over the emerald-colored walls. Between the gurgling rivers of seawater, Tar and Nelda walked until a great arch reared up before them. Huge columns of smooth rock supported the sweep of its curved roof. An immense, heavy curtain of woven seaweed barred the way. Upon that intricate tapestry, in 9 panels, it depicted the creation and destruction of the world, from its birth out of the darkness to its return. The curtain was drawn aside. "Enter Tar," summoned a croaking but powerful voice. "And welcome Nelda." The cave was smaller than the one which preceded it, yet no less important. Here sat the triad, those elders of the tribe who ruled all the others and woe betide any who disobeyed them. Every member of the tribe was there, and as the two figures entered, they turned, their hushed whispers dying. The atmosphere was electric, and all shifted uncomfortably, for this was a black day in their history. Through the corridor, Nelda and Tar moved, coming, finally, to where the elders sat in judgment. The triad sat upon 3 grand thrones. The 2 outer ones were decorated in patterns resembling the sea and stars, but they paled in comparison to the one in the center. The middle throne was magnificent. It dwarfed those beside it. Its broad back thrust upwards to the ceiling, where it clove in 2 to support a great silver lamp. The lamp was the shape of a boat riding waves of glittering crystal. It was dazzling, like the sun on the sea. Sitting upon this throne was the oldest of all the fisherfolk and leader of the triad. Esau had lived for 8 centuries, and each and every one of those years was etched on his face. He was a wizened, shriveled creature whose hands were more like claws. He was impatient, and as Nelda approached, leaned forward with undisguised anticipation. He had waited a long time for this. He squinted at his fellow elders on either side. They were powerless to stop him, and he could not prevent a gleeful cackle issuing from his cracked lips. The elders who flanked Esau swallowed nervously. Both hated what they must do, and they struggled to pronounce what they had been instructed to say. "Daughter of Abe," muttered one of them, "thou hast been brought to this chamber to answer." He stole a glance at Esau and shuddered. His sea-grey eyes closed, and his pity went out to her. "Dost thou remember what occurred 2 moons since? And dost thou recall the words thou didst speak?" Nelda did not look at him, but continued to glare at Esau. "I remember calling you an old fool," she snapped. A murmur ran round the rest of the tribe, but this time they were not angry with her. They agreed. "Be silent." Esau pointed a gnarled finger at Nelda. "Abide by my decision, I did tell thee. And didst thou not answer?" "I did." "And thine own words were?" "So be it." "So be it," he screamed triumphantly. "From her own mouth she doth freely admit the bargain," he cried. "If she did fail to return with the moon kelp, then unto me she would surrender her fate. And without that treasure came she back to these caves." He took a pace closer to her and lowered his ugly, withered head. "Now have I decided," he breathed into her face, "and thou must obey. Nelda Shrimp, thou shalt be my bride." There, it had been said aloud. The fears of the whole tribe had been brought into the light, and the truth of his lust reviled them all. Nelda did not move. Throughout all this she had been in the possession of an icy dignity, but now hot tears streaked down her face. Esau hobbled closer. "Thou shalt be mine at the next full moon." A horrified uproar erupted in the chamber. "The canna intend to wed me granddaughter 2 nights hence," bellowed Tar in outrage. "I do indeed," declared Esau. "There is naught you can do, Tar. The law is with me on this. I have waited too long already. I shall not be kept from her another moon." The clamoring continued, and many vented their opinions on the lecherous elder. "Enough," said Nelda. "I shall marry you," she said. "But the ceremony must be attended by my human friend, the man-child Ben." "A human?" cried Esau. "Wouldst thou invite the entire accursed race into our halls?" "I ask for one only," she replied. "If Ben is not here, then there will be no wedding." The elder sneered and told her, "Thy friend is most welcome to witness our marriage. Yet at that time say unto him all that thou wouldst. When thou art bound to me, the upper world will be forbidden, and thy friend shall be rotting in his grave before the ban is lifted." He turned his back on them all and returned to sit on the throne. The meeting was over. "Now, Edith," Miss Boston said, turning to her friend, "I trust you'll be all right." Miss Weathers, the local postmistress, looked at her doubtfully. "Oh, I really don't feel at all prepared for this," she said. "You did rather spring it upon me. I'm just not qualified to look after 2 boisterous children. What am I to give them to eat?" Miss Boston rolled her eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Edith," she sighed, "pull yourself together. I'm depending on you. The letter from Patricia only arrived a few days ago, and there just wasn't time to arrange anything else. What if something horrendous happens? What am I to do? never was any good in a crisis. I won't be able to cope. I just won't. Miss Boston patted her on the shoulder. Of course you will, Edith. If there is an emergency, you have the telephone number of Patricia's house. But what could possibly happen in 4 days? Oh, goodness me, look at the time. Come along. Do you want me to miss the train? As the two women passed the Gregsons' house, accompanied by Ben and Jennet, the door opened and Nathaniel Crozier smiled at them. "We meet again," he said to Miss Boston. "I told you we would. Off to London now, are you? I hope Mrs. Gunning recovers." Thank you," murmured Miss Boston, but she looked at the man strangely. Nathaniel beamed. Even Jennet found the man's smile pleasant, and she felt the colour rise in her cheeks. Quickly she looked away in embarrassment. "Less than 15 minutes," declared Miss Boston. "Come along." She bustled them through the narrow alley to Church Street. Ben turned to steal a final glance at the man who had caused Jennet to blush. Nathaniel was still standing on the Gregsons' doorstep, but the expression on his face had changed. Ben grimaced at the ugliness of it. Shuddering, he fled back up the alley and joined the others. "What did you say his name was?" Aunt Alice was asking the postmistress. "Mr. Crozier," Edith replied dreamily. "Isn't it a lovely name?" It was Jennet who answered. "Yes," she agreed. "It is lovely." Aunt Alice was too lost in her own thoughts. Where had she heard that name before? "Here we are," Mr. Parks grinned, flourishing the correct set of keys. "I'll have the door open in a jiffy, Mr. Crozier." Nathaniel was too busy surveying the grand building to answer. It was one of the oldest properties in Whitby. Some parts of it dated back to the 10th century, and perhaps further still. "Impressive, isn't it?" said the estate agent. "Yes, we're very pleased to have this one on our books. Been in the Banbury Scott family for, many years, this had. A real showpiece it was." The large oak door opened and he waved Nathaniel in from the lawn. "Now you do understand about the damage?" he asked. "I gather the last owner made some structural alterations." "Actually," Mr. Parks explained, "there's a little more to it than that. Now, don't misunderstand me. The damage is only superficial. There's nothing in here that can't be repaired." He sidled indoors and tried to dispel the icy tingle that was prickling the hairs on his neck. "Yes," he began, "as you can see, there is rather a lot of splintered wood." He did not mention how it had been done. The thought of a mad woman racing round the house swinging an axe was enough to put anybody off. Nathaniel prowled round like a hound after a scent. When they reached the drawing-room, his agitation was plain to see. "In your opinion, what would drive someone to such destruction?" Mr. Parks saw that it was time to tell him the whole truth. He lowered his voice. "By all accounts, Mrs. Cooper was rather peculiar. As soon as she got her hands on this place, she sacked all the staff and went on the rampage, totally unhinged, not a doubt of it. She was obviously a mental patient of some sort. Still, she didn't murder anyone, so that's something to be thankful for." Nathaniel allowed himself a private smile and asked dryly, "Do you know what happened to her?" "Disappeared," said the estate agent, snapping his fingers, "without a trace. The police couldn't find her anywhere. I think she threw herself into the sea. People like that do all sorts of silly things, don't they?" Nathaniel had seen enough. "Oh, but you haven't seen half of the property yet," exclaimed a disappointed Mr. Parks. "You haven't even glimpsed the garden at the back. Do you know that after she ransacked the house, the demented creature went outside and almost demolished the garden shed?" Nathaniel hesitated. "You know, Mr. Parks," he said, "I believe I will examine this garden of yours." The garden of the Banbury Scott residence had been as grand as the building it surrounded, but for 2 months it had been neglected. The grass desperately needed cutting, and dead leaves floated in the ornamental pond. Nathaniel wandered away and headed for an old stone hut situated against the garden wall. He pushed the door open. It looked like a whirlwind had visited the place. Nathaniel picked his way through the rubble. The near wall had certainly been ripped open. Most of the plaster that had covered it now lay at his feet, and he ran his fingers across the bare stone it had revealed. There was a long trough cut into it. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, and he stooped to search among the dusty heaps of broken plaster. From the piles of rubbish he brought out a fragment of plaster as large as his hand. One side was smooth, except for 4 strange symbols that had been gouged into it. A look of understanding passed over his face. "Oh, Rosalind," he breathed. "How could you have made such a fatal blunder? Did you really give no heed to these?" He inspected the fragments more closely. "The central sign is the mark of Hilda," he observed. "But what of the 3 which circle round it? Why were you so blind?" He could hardly contain his excitement. This confirmed all his researches and made every risk worthwhile. Quickly he slipped it into his pocket and stepped back outside. "I thought I saw a rat dart from the rubbish. I thought there might be a nest." Mr. Parks was appalled and pulled a horrified face. "I think I've seen all I need to for the moment," Nathaniel continued. "Thank you for your time." Jennet lay the book on her knee and ate a biscuit. It was blissfully quiet and peaceful, as both Ben and Miss Weathers were out and she was alone in the cottage reading. She turned her attention back to the book. Desert Amour was a romantic novel that Miss Weathers had brought with her. Jennet usually had no time for that sort of literature, but today she made an exception and was surprised to find herself enjoying it when a knock sounded at the front door. Jennet considered letting whoever it was go away, but she put down the book and left the parlour to investigate. "Good afternoon," said Nathaniel once she had opened the door. "Isn't it a glorious day for November?" Jennet tried to conceal her pleasure at seeing him. "Mr. Crozier, isn't it?" "Please," he said, "call me Nathaniel." His deep black eyes shone out at her, and Jennet felt weak under their unwavering glare. "I seem to be locked out of the Gregsons," he lied. "I wonder if you would be so kind as to invite me into your house for the time being until they return." "Oh," said Jennet uncertainly, "I shouldn't. You see, there's only me here, and Aunt Alice told me—" Nathaniel nodded. "Then I wouldn't dream of bothering you any further. I quite understand, and won't be in the least bit offended." He began walking back, but Jennet called after him, "No, don't do that. I'm sure it's all right. Please, come in." She showed him into the parlour, and the man looked about with interest. He was particularly taken with the books on the shelves. "Your aunt has an eccentric collection," he remarked. "Does she really believe in this stuff? I hope such ridiculous faith doesn't run in the family." Jennet shook her head. "She isn't really my aunt," she confided. "Ben and I just call her that, and no, I don't really believe in it, or I try not to. I don't even read the horoscopes." "Very wise," he commented. "And what sort of thing do you read?" "Oh, you know," she said airily. "All kinds." Her voice faltered, for Nathaniel was glancing at the armchair where Desert Amour lay open in all its shameless glory. Jennet felt herself blush. That's Miss Weathers," she blurted hastily. Nathaniel gave her a knowing look. "There is no harm in dreams. Fantasies are as necessary to us as breathing. We must chase after our desires and embrace them. Do you not agree?" "Yes." He held her with his smile. "Where are your parents?" he asked. She looked down at the carpet before answering. They died 2 years ago." "That must have been very difficult for you." "It was. Still is." "You have been very brave. Your eyes tell me this. A great deal can be learned from the study of one's eyes. They are the mirrors of the soul. Tell me, Jennet, what do you see in mine?" Jennet wanted to look, and yet deep down some instinct was warning her not to. "Look at me, Jennet," Nathaniel pressed. Slowly she raised her head and stared into his eyes. They're so dark," she whispered. "Black and cold, like splinters of black glass." "Sit down," he told her. At once Jennet obeyed. She was completely in his power and had no will of her own. "Tell me, child," he demanded. "Tell me what you know of Rowena Cooper." And so Jennet told him everything. She spoke in a dead monotone. How Rowena had searched for the magical staff of Hilda, murdering several of Aunt Alice's friends in the process, and how she had at last found the staff, wielding it to the peril of everybody. When she had finished, Nathaniel was not at all pleased. He paced around the room. "And the staff of Hilda," he cried. "Where is it now? Does Alice Boston possess it?" "No," droned Jennet's reply. "It was taken from this world altogether." Nathaniel relaxed. "Good. Then that leaves the way clear. Thank you, my child. I can see you shall be very useful. It is perhaps unfortunate that your brother has the sight. Even more worrying is the fact that it was he who discovered the moon kelp. Now he has the favor of the lords of the deep. Still, I trust I can achieve my goal. One 8-year-old thorn in my side is something I can handle." Jennet rubbed her eyes. She had the most excruciating headache. Dizzily she stared across at the man. He was chatting away as if they had known each other for years. Try as she might, she could not recall what they had been talking about. "Are you all right?" asked Nathaniel with concern. "You look almost green." "I've been rabbiting on, haven't I? Forgive me." He smiled at her. "The Gregsons must be back by now. Thank you so much for inviting me in. You have been a most enchanting hostess." Rising from the chair, he gave the girl a formal bow. Jennet felt the butterflies flutter inside. "Let me see you out," she offered eagerly. "Au revoir," he told her, taking hold of her hand and kissing it. Jennet laughed with delight and opened the door. Ben lay before the coal fire. Mr. Roper's front room was the perfect cosy spot to spend a rainy afternoon, and when the fire crackled in the grate, it was a delicious, snug nest. Mr. Roper lived by himself on the West Cliff. Since the death of his wife, he had become increasingly isolated from other people. Without his Margaret, he found the world a bleak, confusing place. When Miss Boston first met him, he was in a lamentable state, unshaven and dirty, not caring how he looked or lived. It was she who shook him out of his despondency. Now he took pride in himself again, and kept the house as Margaret would have wished. He had a lot to thank Miss Boston for, and never forgot the fact. When she had first mentioned that she was going to foster 2 unknown children, he was the only one in all her circle of friends who gave her encouragement, and now he was glad that he had. Ben and Mr. Roper got on famously, and once a week the boy would visit the old man. On fine days they would go fishing off one of the piers, but when the rain kept them indoors, the old man would entertain Ben by recounting stories of his life and those of his family. All 3 of Mr. Roper's elder brothers had been killed in the Great War, and he himself had won a medal in the one that followed. Mr. Roper returned from the kitchen carrying a glass of lemonade. "Tell me more about the war," Ben asked. "You don't want to listen to my boring stories," chortled the old man. "It's time you told me one of your own." "I don't know any," came the reply. "You don't know any," cried Mr. Roper in disbelief. "Don't you go telling me that Alice Boston hasn't been filling your head full of tales, a wealth of stories she's got." Ben grinned. But as he glanced out of the window, he saw that it was growing dark. Miss Weathers had told him to be back before nightfall, and he dreaded to think what fuss she would make if he stayed out later than he ought to. Mr. Roper knew what the boy was thinking. "All right, lad," he said. "You'd best get going. I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of one of Edith Weathers' lectures." Mr. Roper opened the door, and the chill November afternoon blew in as Ben wandered down the short path. When he reached the gate, the old man called to him, "And make sure you remember a story to tell me. You'll not get out of it that easily." Laughing, the boy waved and set off home. It had been a breakneck, nerve-rattling journey all the way from King's Cross. Anyone would think the cabby was driving the getaway car from a bank robbery. But at last they arrived in Kensington, and the taxi shot past the great museums before turning off into one of the quieter streets. With a jolt, the vehicle skidded to a standstill, and Miss Boston's hat sailed out of the window. "Here we are, missus," the cabby announced, "safe and sound." The old lady gave him a frosty look and rummaged in her purse for the fare. She alighted from the taxi, put her case on the pavement, and waddled into the road to retrieve her hat before she looked about her. It was an impressive street. All the buildings were Georgian town houses, the kind that only embassies or film stars could now afford. Miss Boston cast an eye over herself. Her clothes looked a wreck, and she felt far too shabby to enter one of these grand houses. She spent a few moments smoothing the creases from her skirt. Then, pulling her cape about her, she ascended the steps to number 11 and rang the bell. The minutes ticked by, but nobody came to the door. Miss Boston pressed the bell again. Suddenly, the door was pulled open, and a superior voice demanded, "What have we here?" The old lady looked up sheepishly. A tall, grey-haired man was studying her with the utmost solemnity. "Whatever it is, we don't want any," he said curtly. "Good day." "I beg your pardon," she declared, "but I am Alice Boston. Patricia Gunning has invited me to stay for a few days." The man made no attempt to let her in. "Mrs. Gunning sees no one," he said. Miss Boston was about to give the man a good telling off when he turned as someone spoke to him from inside. "Let her in?" he asked in surprise. "This is all very irregular." The first thing that struck her as she walked inside was the piercing chill. Descending the stairs was an uncommonly ugly woman. Her face was ill-proportioned and square, with a large, jutting chin. But the eyes which fixed upon Miss Boston were small and pig-like. Her bearing was masculine, and her frame one that any rugby player would have been proud of. "Welcome, Miss Boston." The woman shook the old lady's hand vigorously. "I am Judith Deacon," she said, "Miss Gunning's private nurse." Miss Boston flexed her squashed fingers. "How is Patricia?" she asked. "Mrs. Gunning is most unwell. I'm afraid there isn't much hope for her. I confess that I tried to dissuade her from inviting you. I don't approve of anything that overexcites her." "Most commendable," Miss Boston put in, "but I'm not exactly sure of what ails her. Could you enlighten me?" "It began when she caught a bad cold, and progressed from there. She's quite old, you know." Miss Boston reared her head. Patricia Gunning was nearly 10 years younger than herself, and had always shared the same vigorous health. "Do you think I could see her now?" she asked. "You can have 10 minutes with her, that's all." She spun on her heel and addressed the man who had opened the door. "Rook, take Miss Boston's luggage up to the guest room on the 2nd floor." "Very well," said Rook, greatly vexed at the inconvenience. "Don't mind Rook," the nurse told her. "He's only a butler with an inflated opinion of himself." "Indeed," said the old lady, privately thinking exactly the same about her. And that is the end of side 1. It was the most unusual sick room Miss Boston had ever seen. To get in, she had to duck beneath a swinging bunch of dried herbs. A pungent, aromatic scent laced the air. Strange pictures and symbols filled the spaces in between the dead plants, designs taken from old magical works, charms of protection and healing. Miss Boston recognized them instantly, but thought nothing of it, knowing as she did that Patricia Gunning was a white witch. A magnificent four-poster bed took up most of the room. At its foot, from a silver incense burner, streamed a steady thread of green smoke. It was this that was responsible for the overpowering smell. Miss Boston walked up to the bed. Through the expanse of covers, she saw a small figure lying on its side. "Patricia," Miss Boston began. "Is that you?" Very slowly the figure moved. Patricia Gunning was a frail woman of 83 years. Her face was shrunken, and her limbs were brittle sticks. With difficulty she lifted her head, and her long silver hair floated about her shoulders. "Alice," came her sweet, tinkling voice. "Oh, Alice, I'm so pleased to see you." Judith Deacon watched icily as the two friends hugged one another. "Dear Patricia," exclaimed Miss Boston, "it really is good to see you again." Her friend sank back onto the pillows and smiled. "I was not sure if you would come," she sighed. "You look marvelous, a real tonic to me." "Well, it looks as though you could do with one," observed Miss Boston truthfully. "I think we could start by opening a window or two. I don't know how you can breathe." Judith Deacon moved in front of the nearest window. "No draught," she said, "and the incense is vital to the regime I've instigated solely for Mrs. Gunning's benefit." The woman on the bed closed her eyes. "Oh, Alice," she breathed, "I know how ill I am. I'm dying. There's no escaping that fact." The ever-watchful Judith came forward. "Time for your medication, Mrs. Gunning." Miss Boston watched the nurse pour a small quantity of thick brown liquid onto a spoon. "Surely that isn't one of your own brews, Patricia?" she asked in amazement. "Mrs. Gunning's potions are better than anything from the chemist," the nurse answered for her. Miss Boston couldn't believe it. "But don't you think you ought to try conventional medicine?" she asked. "We know what we're doing," rapped the nurse. "Now open wide, Mrs. Gunning." For an instant, Miss Boston thought she caught a frightened look on her friend's face. "That's a good girl," said Miss Deacon, inspecting the spoon. "All gone now." "The doctor's been to see Mrs. Gunning," the nurse said. "Unfortunately, he said there was nothing he could do." Miss Boston was appalled. "Alice," Patricia broke in, "tell me all your news. Did you really adopt those children you wrote to me about? I hope my influence helped." She spoke hurriedly, as if trying to defuse the situation. They exchanged a few brief sentences, then Miss Deacon announced that it was time for her patient's nap. "But I've only just arrived," Miss Boston protested. "Surely a few more minutes won't matter." The nurse threw her a vicious look. "Mrs. Gunning," she began, "I will not have your routine disrupted. Would you kindly tell your friend not to interfere in matters she is patently ignorant of? If she questions my authority once more, I shall pack up and leave. Is that what you want?" "No," Patricia cried, her whole body trembling. She placed her shaking hand on Miss Boston's arm. "Promise, Alice," she insisted, "that while you're here, you'll follow Judith's instructions, however unorthodox you might think them." "I promise," Miss Boston relented. "I suppose you know what you're doing." The nurse ushered her to the door. "I will permit one more visit this evening," she told her. "Now perhaps you would care to go to your room. Your dinner will be in the dining room at 7 o'clock sharp." At 7 o'clock, Miss Boston was seated at the long dining table while the butler served her dinner. It was one of the most disheartening meals she had ever eaten. Sitting alone was bad enough, but the food itself was barely palatable. "I take it Miss Deacon will not be joining me," she said to Rook. "No," came the pert reply. "She always dines with the mistress in her bedchamber." "Such devotion," the old lady commented, tentatively sipping her lukewarm soup. "And do you cook the meals for them as well?" "Miss Deacon sees to both the mistress's and her own requirements, madam," he said. "I am left to fend for myself. We have had no outside company for many months now, not since cook was dismissed." "Don't you think that rather odd?" "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, madam," he replied. "The mistress knows what she's doing, but I haven't seen her for God knows how long. I am here merely to serve. I know my place." Rook removed the bowl and went to fetch the main course. Miss Boston sniffed. Surely she detected a decidedly alcoholic smell. After a full 15 minutes, Rook came staggering into the trolley before him. His legs seemed unable to coordinate properly, and he tripped more than once on the way. Rook was definitely drunk. Miss Boston ate as much as she could and leaned back in her chair. At once, Rook snatched the plate away and sent the whole thing clattering back on the trolley. Lettuce leaves flew everywhere. Swaying unsteadily, Rook bent down to retrieve them. "Would madam care for dessert?" he slurred. "No, thank you," she answered. Rook fixed her with one bleary eye. "And why not?" he demanded. "What's wrong with it?" "Oh, nothing, I'm sure," said the old lady, feeling rather awkward. "But if you insist, I will have some, please." Another 15 minutes dragged by. When Rook returned, he was practically riding on the trolley and brought it to a thunderous halt right beside the old lady's chair. "Here it is," he declared. "Get your false teeth round this, madam." Onto the table he tossed a bowl of tinned peaches and poured a quantity of cream over everywhere except where it was wanted. "Strangely enough," Miss Boston stormed, "I actually prefer the cream on the peaches, not on me. I have never seen such a disgraceful exhibition. You, sir, are as drunk as a lord. I suggest you go and make yourself a strong cup of coffee forthwith, and I'll have you know that all my teeth are my own. Good night." She raged out of the dining room, leaving Rook gaping after her. "Good gracious," he burbled, smiling. "What a smashing temper the old crock has." Miss Boston spent the next half-hour sponging her clothes. When a knock sounded at her door, she almost missed it. The old lady hurried to the door and opened it. Judith Deacon was standing there. "Mrs. Gunning has asked to see you and is waiting. Follow me, please." Miss Boston was led once more to the sick room, but as soon as she stepped inside, she could see that her friend was visibly weaker. "Patricia," Miss Boston said. "It's Alice." The patient moved her head at the sound of the voice, but did not seem to see her. "Alice," she began with a desperate urgency. "Alice, listen to me. Please, you must remember that I didn't have a choice. You must not delay. I don't matter anymore." Judith Deacon took a step closer. "What are you trying to tell me?" said Miss Boston, concerned at the anxiety that had contorted her friend's face. "Oh, forgive me, Alice. Evil," she cried, gripping Miss Boston's hand. "Great evil." "That will be all," broke in Judith. "Really, Miss Boston, I must ask you to leave. Can't you see you're upsetting my patient?" "But she's trying to tell me something." "She's delirious," said the nurse sternly. "These fits come over her from time to time." She gave Miss Boston an angry look and said, "Please do as I say." The old lady rose, but Patricia was unwilling to let her go. "No, don't leave me." "Out!" ordered Judith furiously. "She is too ill for you to be present. I think it would be best if you didn't see her again tonight. She might be more lucid in the morning." "Yes," Miss Boston murmured. "Poor Patricia. I pray she'll be stronger then." Judith watched as the old lady unhappily plodded off before turning with a cruel glint in her eyes. "You've been a bad girl, Mrs. Gunning," Judith snarled. "That was very naughty. You know you're not allowed to tell her, don't you? You've almost ruined everything." The pig-like eyes flashed and the nurse growled. "Well, you won't have a second chance." She raised one of her strong hands and clenched it into a fist. Mrs. Gunning cringed into the pillows. Ben had slept fitfully. Most of the bedclothes lay in a crumpled heap where he had kicked them. In the middle of the night he rolled over and awoke. The house was incredibly still and quiet. He did not want to wake his sister or Miss Weathers. Instead, he hurried down through the black hall, fumbling for the handle of the kitchen door. Once safely within, he ran the tap and filled a cup with water. Just as he was about to climb back up the stairs, he paused. From the yard outside came the sound of a front door closing, followed by determined footsteps ringing over the concrete. Curious, Ben quickly nipped into the front room and peered out from behind the curtains. Nearby stood Nathaniel Crozier. He had just left the Gregsons' house and was carrying a large, heavy-looking bag. What was he doing out there? What's he up to, then? Ben asked himself. It was 2:30 in the morning. He scowled. Without pausing to think what might happen, he dashed into the hall, dragged his coat from the peg, and hurried outside. The cold November night bit into him, nipping the bare spaces between the top of his slippers and the bottom of his pajama legs. He gave no thought to his reckless actions, nor how stupid he was being. All Ben could think about was Nathaniel. There was something extremely dislikable and wrong about that man, no matter what Jennet thought of him. Nipping in and out of the gloomy doorways, Ben gradually followed Nathaniel to the top of the 199 steps. Nathaniel gave no heed to the view. The great dark shape of St. Mary's Church reared up before him, blotting out the frosty stars in the black sky. The pathway curved round to the rear of the church and came to a large wooden door. Flourishing a crowbar from his bag, Nathaniel marched up to the great door and thrust one end deep into a slender crevice inches above the handle. The lock was torn from the wood and the door shook violently. Nathaniel gave it a contemptuous kick and it swung slowly inwards. Within the Church of St. Mary, all was shadow. "Settle yourself, Crozier," he murmured. "It's nothing you haven't encountered before." He ran his hand over the stone. "This is most holy ground," he whispered. "You must tread with care this night." He took a few tentative steps towards the center aisle. At the far end upon the altar, the gold cross gleamed coldly, and Nathaniel hesitated. "Enough," he spat. "I will pass." And with that he pushed deeper into the church. The crypt of St. Mary's was reached by a cramped flight of wooden stairs. It was perhaps the oldest part of the building, and contained many artifacts which dated from the original Saxon church. Down into this crowded level Nathaniel came. He delved into his pocket and brought out the plaster fragment he had taken from the Banbury Scots house. In the shaft of moonlight he studied the 4 strange signs inscribed there. Apart from the mark of St. Hilda, only one was now clear to him. "Somewhere here," he told himself. "It can be nowhere else." He closed his eyes and began to chant under his breath. A strange stillness descended over the church, and the moon disappeared behind a cloud. A breeze began to stir. The brass chandelier slowly began to swing, and a hymn sheet fluttered from the pulpit. Still Nathaniel chanted, and the air churned about him. The Warlock's hair streamed in the growing gale, and the rush of wind filled his ears as it tore around the church. The chandelier was spinning madly now, and hymn sheets flew through the air like flocks of rustling birds. "Unveil yourself," Nathaniel cried. "Show yourself to me. I, Nathaniel Crozier, High Priest of the Black Scepter, command you." Suddenly there was a terrible crash as the cross on the altar was hurled to the ground. The Warlock opened his hands, stared down at the plaster fragment, and smiled. One of the symbols inscribed there was glowing. A golden light beat out of it, pulsing with life and energy. From the depths of one of the many dark shadows there came an answering throb of golden radiance. It was a life-sized head of stone. Most of the features had been worn away, but the eyes and mouth could still be discerned. Nathaniel took the head in his hands, and the beautiful light shone in his face. "Now you are mine," he marveled, "and now you shall answer me." The stone pulsated with magical force, its light reaching high into the church, and a delicious warmth rippled out into the night. "Stop!" commanded Nathaniel, trying to shield his eyes from the blinding light. "Stop!" Even at this time of night, someone was bound to see what was happening. He had to put an end to it, and with clenched teeth called on all his dark powers. "Aid me," he demanded. "Give me the strength to counter, conquer, and rule." For a moment nothing happened. But then another glow began to appear. It was a sickly, greenish hue, and it flickered about Nathaniel's hands as he called for aid. When the two opposing forces met, they crackled and spat. And the contest was finished. The golden energy faded, engulfed in Nathaniel's all-devouring hatred. "Hath the time now come?" the head asked. "Is the end of all things arrived? Is Ragnarok upon us?" "The end is not yet here," replied Nathaniel. "But that hour may not be far away." The stone eyes rasped open to reveal two slivers of flint. They studied Nathaniel closely, and the voice asked, "Who art thou? Why didst thou invoke me?" "My name is Crozier. The world is in peril, and I must do what I can to help. There are many questions which only you can answer if I am to prevent the darkness creeping over the land. Tell to me all your wisdom." The head replied mournfully. "The third guardian am I," it said, "defender of the weak against the power that sleeps and must not stir." "Power?" repeated the Warlock. "Explain. What power do you speak of?" "Thou canst not understand," lamented the head. "The world has moved on." "Please," Nathaniel asked, "I want to know. Tell me of that distant time." The head then recounted events that occurred many ages ago. While it spoke, Nathaniel listened, concealing the greed and malice that boiled within him. It was a wild land, the carving revealed. The 5 tribes of the Aufwaders lived along all the coast, and man was as yet a stranger in this place. Since the time of waking, evil has stalked the world. Yet here in Whitby the Dark One had indeed made its home. The Aufwaders suffered much and prayed unceasingly to the lords of the deep, who did hear their woe and take pity. There came a fearful day when the sun shone red with war, and the lords arose from the foaming deep for battle. In a deadly encounter that threw down cliffs, they did attack, but the enemy was mighty and blew poisonous rain upon them. Their vast army was almost vanquished, yet finally they won through, and the great lord himself grappled with the evil, deposing it in bitter combat. All rejoiced, but even as their lord prepared to deal the death blow, his heart forewarned that the battle would not be won that day. Though the enemy be slain, it could never be destroyed, and would in time return and conquer, bringing about the ruin of all. Thus he stepped aside and refused to dispatch the enemy. So, to the dismay of all, the evil was spared, but the deep ones bound it in chains of enchantment, and it passed out of knowledge. Interesting, interrupted Nathaniel with little enthusiasm. What has an archaic legend to do with your presence here? Ignoring his skepticism, the head began again. Even the strongest chain shall weaken, it told him. So did the bonds of enchantment wither, and they who first felt the rumor of the returning evil were afraid. Earl, mightiest of all outwaders, sought to strengthen the enchantment of the deep ones, and wrought a talisman to keep the evil one at bay. For this undertaking he did steal the moon kelp, and so was punished, but not till he completed his task. Hidden from the 5 tribes, this sacred artifact kept strong the enchanted bonds, and the world was safe again. But power fades, and a day came when Earl's guardian was not enough. Another was required. This was fashioned by the first of the human settlers, who learned of the danger from the 5 tribes before they were estranged. A wise man, he made a sign of the moon, calling on the goddess herself to guide his work. And then, who can measure the rate of a canker that grows mighty in repose? The time came when another guardian was needed, and so was I brought into being. The eyes closed sadly. Nathaniel nodded. And in the time of Hilda, another guardian was needed, and so she surrendered her staff. Verily, returned the head, when Hilda came, already my labors were too great, and evil was beginning to escape. A malekin had evaded my vigilance and slithered into the waking world. It was she who drove it back. Yet the staff is no more. It has gone from this place, and it was the strongest guardian of all. Once more the evils are stirring. The malekin walks abroad again, and soon shall the evil waken, and all will plunge into darkness and despair. Is there nothing that can be done to prevent this disaster? Asked Nathaniel. The head groaned. Who now can forge and craft a device to protect us all? The Warlock gave a small, unpleasant laugh. Perhaps I can, he said. You, the head muttered, are your talents a match for what is needed? I believe so, came the arrogant reply. Then waste no time, urged the carving. Begin at once. Nathaniel rubbed his chin. What I must really achieve is some way of uniting all the existing guardians and building upon their proven strength. But where am I to find them? I can help, the head cried. I know where they were bestowed. You know, smiled Nathaniel. I was rather hoping you'd say that. Behind him, a shadowy figure crawled along the aisle, slipping silently behind the pew boxes. Ben crept towards the spectral gleam which emanated from the crypt, straining to catch what the voices said, yet anxious not to be discovered. The oldest of the guardians is with the outwaders, the head was telling Nathaniel, and from this shall the nature of the evil be known. Nathaniel considered this information. And the second guardian, he demanded? Is a wooden tablet, the head told him, inlaid with pearl. The irresistible force of the waxing moon is its strength, and is mightiest when it is full in the sky. But where can I find it? Stormed Nathaniel impatiently. "The second guardian was entrusted to a Whitby family," the head replied, "and since pagan times they have kept it safe, passing it down through generation after generation. What they may be called now, I do not know. All I can sense is that the guardian is still safe. Tell me, O Oracle, what would happen if all the guardians were destroyed?" "Then darkness would reign," the head cried. "Ragnarok would come." "Such melodrama," Nathaniel scoffed. "Do you really expect me to believe that? There is nothing on this earth I cannot make bow before me." "No!" shrieked the head. "You must not believe that. No one has dominion over evil. It consumes all who try to master it." "I think I've heard enough now, thank you," Nathaniel retorted. "You've done your duty for far too long, in my opinion. Your time is over." With one swift swing of his arms, he raised the crowbar over his head and brought it crashing down. "No!" came a heart-rending scream. In his hiding place, Ben covered his ears. He was terrified at what he had heard, and as the vicious blows fell, he sprang to his feet. Like a thing possessed, Nathaniel pounded the pieces to powder, crowing with horrendous savagery. Ben hurtled from the church as fast as he could. When he reached the top of the abbey steps, the ground shook. From the church of St. Mary there came a deafening explosion. The leaded roof buckled as a gaping hole was blasted out of it, and through this shot a stream of golden light. And then it vanished. Only an ugly great rent remained in the leaded roof. Sickened and horrified, the boy turned back to the town which lay below him. In the crypt, Nathaniel drew from his pocket the plaster fragment. There were now only 3 symbols inscribed there, and one of those was the obsolete mark of Hilda. Because of him, the sign of the last guardian had been completely erased. "One down, 2 to go," he quietly chortled. It was past 10 o'clock when Ben dragged his clothes on and dashed onto the landing. "Jen!" he cried. "Jen! You'll never believe me." "Down here," came his sister's voice. "We're in the kitchen." Ben jumped the last 2 steps and hurried to tell her what he had witnessed. "I know, I shouldn't have," he gabbled. "He's bad, Jen. I mean really bad. All the way to the church I followed him and heard everything." As the boy entered the kitchen, his stomach turned over. Standing there chatting to his sister was Nathaniel Crozier. "What's he doing here?" Jennet was taken aback by this rudeness. "Ben," she hissed. "Well?" "Jennet," said Nathaniel, "it would seem your brother does not like me." "Oh, I'm sorry. He isn't usually as bad-mannered as this." She gave Ben a hateful glance. "Where's Miss Weathers?" Ben asked his sister. "Gone to church," she replied. "Your breakfast's on the table." "I'm not eating it with him here." "Ben!" Jennet stormed. She turned to Nathaniel. "Don't pay any attention to him. You just stay here and have another coffee." "If you insist," said Nathaniel, giving Ben a venomous and deadly look. "I'm off," the boy said abruptly. In a trice, he was through the door. "I don't know what's come over him," Jennet sighed. "Perhaps he's had a nightmare," the man suggested. "Would you forgive me if I declined that second coffee? I really must get going. There seems to be more work in store for me today than I had at first realized." Jennet showed him the door. She watched him return to the Gregsons' house before closing the door with a dreamy look on her face. Mr. Roper opened the front door. "Ben!" he exclaimed in surprise. "You're early. Come in, come in." Leading Ben to the front room, the old man asked gently, What's addled you then, lad?" Ben fidgeted for a moment. "Mr. Roper, have you seen the man who's staying with the Gregsons?" "Can't say that I have." "There is a man staying there," confirmed Ben. "His name's Crozier. And he's bad," Ben said simply. Mr. Roper put his teacup down. "What do you mean?" he asked. And so Ben began to tell him all that had happened last night. "And then he smashed the head to bits," Ben said, coming to the conclusion of the tale. "And a great light shot out of the church roof and vanished into the sky. I waited till this morning to tell Jennet, but when I woke up she was already downstairs with him. And now he knows that I saw everything. Something absolutely terrible is going to happen. I know it." Mr. Roper let out a deep breath. An admiring smile was on his lips. "Well, I never," he said. "When I told you to come back with a story, I wasn't expecting anything as riveting as that one. Full marks." "But it's all true," the boy whispered. "I promise." "Of course it is," agreed the old man. "And as soon as I get a chance, I'll phone the head wizard and tell him what one of his dastardly pupils is up to." Ben decided it was pointless trying to make the old man believe him. It was clearly too fantastic a tale for anyone. What would happen if Mr. Crozier got his way? According to what he had heard, nothing would be safe. "Oh, lad," sighed Mr. Roper unexpectedly. His voice trembled, and before Ben knew what to think, the old man whisked away and returned, carrying a large square tin. "These are for you," he said quietly. "I were going to save them for tomorrow, but you might as well have them now. I remember the best bit about fireworks was looking at them in the box, all them fancy wrappers with stars and flashes on them." "Fireworks!" cried Ben. "For me! Oh, thank you!" He threw his arms around the old man and gave him a great hug. Mr. Roper uttered a startled cry, holding the boy as if it was the last time he would ever see him. "Ah," he mumbled. "Them's all yours. Enjoy 'em, lad. Now, come on. You'd best be off." The old man watched Ben turn down the alleyway, then closed the door. "Goodbye, lad," he wept. Ben bit his lip. His sister was being a real pain. Since he had returned from Mr. Roper's, she had done nothing but scold him for being rude to Nathaniel. And when he had tried to escape her, she had followed him into the garden, only to criticize all his attempts at bonfire building. There was no getting away from her, and he thought ruefully of the fireworks the old man had given him. He hadn't even had a chance to open the tin yet. Suddenly there came a fierce hammering on the front door. Jennet pulled the door open. She cast her eyes around the yard. It was dark and deserted. The November evening had fallen thickly, filling the place with silence and night shadows. "Weird," she said. "There's nobody out here." Ben said nothing, for standing on the step, leaning on his staff and glowering impatiently, was Nelda's grandfather. The boy blinked in astonishment. "Hello," he began nervously. It was most unusual for any of the fisher folk to call on a human. "Is there something wrong?" he asked. His sister looked down at him. "Of course there isn't," she answered. Tar gave Jennet a curious stare. "Daft as out," he remarked. There's summat wrong, all right, very wrong." Ben tugged at his sister's sleeve. "Jen," he hissed, "there is someone here. It's Nelda's grandfather." Oh! There were times when she completely forgot about her brother's gift. "What does he want?" she asked. "I don't know." The Aufwader scratched his wiry white whiskers. "'Tis Nelda," he said. "She's the one what bid me come and see thee." "Nelda!" exclaimed the boy. "But why didn't she come herself?" The outwader shook his head sorrowfully. Nelda were busy, he said. Were tasks she had to see to. This night the moon'll be full, and at such times do the bridings take place. When the tide comes high up the cliff, my granddaughter'll wed. Married? Ben whispered in disbelief. But who? But Tar was tutting at the lateness of the hour. Is tha coming or not? Me? If tha's willing, best come along now. Bid thy sister good night, for thou'lt not be back before dawn. Leaning on his staff, Tar hobbled slowly across the yard. Wait! Ben called after him. The boy turned to Jennet and hurriedly tried to explain what was happening. Pretend I've gone to bed, he said. Miss Weathers won't look in, and remember to leave the latch off the door. Who is she marrying? I thought she was still quite young. Tar ground his teeth together. Aye, he bitterly agreed. She'm a child still, but that hasna stopped him. Pausing at the few steps which led to the shore, he muttered darkly, The omens are bad for this. I done seen fish floating dead on the waves. This briding ain't proper, and if it goes ahead, well, I doesn't dwell on what may come about. I speak no more on it. Wrapped in an uneasy silence, they vanished onto the sands, merging into the cloak of night. Mr. Taylor, the curator of the museum, gave one last glance around. Everything seemed in order. With a jingle of keys, he strode across the art gallery to join the last visitor, who was lingering by the main entrance. He turned the lock. Lovely, he beamed. That'll keep the robbers out. I trust you did find out what you were after, he asked. I did indeed. They shook one another by the hand, and as the curator went his way, Nathaniel said, Thank you again. It's been a most enlightening day. The warm buzz of the radio diffused through the darkened front room. In the fireplace, the embers were a deep cherry color, and when they crumbled, the sound of the falling ash was like an expiring sigh. Mr. Roper sat in his shabby armchair, his eyes closed, but he was not asleep. Oh, Margaret, he murmured. A right mess I'm in. The doorbell rang. The old man looked up. It was 11:30. Wearily, he struggled to his feet and shuffled out into the hallway. A tall figure was silhouetted against the glass of the door. Opening the door, Mr. Roper beheld for the first time Nathaniel Crozier. Yes, Mr. Roper began. Can I help you? Good evening to you, Nathaniel purred. Would I be right in assuming you to be Arnold Roper? Who wants to know? My name is Crozier. I am a historian researching into local history. The old man showed no outward sign of surprise that someone should come and see him at this late hour. Arnold were my elder brother, died in the Great War, so you're wasting your time. Nathaniel straightened, taken aback at this news. Died, he repeated. Did he leave an heir? Arnold were only 17, weren't even courting. No, I'm sorry, it's too parky shutting on doorsteps. The Warlock smiled. Then may I come in, he asked, just for a moment. Nathaniel stepped inside. About your brother, Nathaniel continued. What happened to his belongings after he died? The old man ignored him for a moment. Didn't have much on him, he said at last. Only a watch and a photograph of us all. Nathaniel sprang forward and grabbed him by the shoulders. Don't play games with me, he commanded. Mr. Roper remained perfectly calm. Nathaniel screamed, Tell me where it is, you old fool! Mr. Roper's face held the expression one might show to a boasting child. Are you so sure of yourself? Came his astonishingly cool reply. The bearded man's eyes were filled with fury. "It's only a matter of time," he said. "Do we really need to undergo this charade? You've made a stand. Now tell me." The old man stared at Nathaniel, and his face filled with wonderment and awe. "Can you imagine how ancient it is, or how many of my ancestors have lived and died in its service? It has been a sacred trust," he whispered, "and I'm not about to betray that for the likes of you. I'd rather die than help you." Nathaniel burst out laughing. "Oh, I know that," he chuckled. "That's the whole point, you see. So much better to hurt you first, though. After all, I deserve a little enjoyment from this. Now then," he said brightly, "are you going to tell me where the second guardian is hidden?" "Never. My family's kept that holy thing safe for too long," replied Mr. Roper. "What right have you got to take it now?" "The right of conquest," answered Nathaniel coldly. His dark eyes opened wide, and the full might of his power came shouting out of them. "Now," he hissed. "Tell me." Mr. Roper gasped and dropped to his knees. It was as though a tremendous weight was pinning him down. Bolts of searing pain lashed his body, stabbing, scalding, breaking. He uttered a feeble wail, then hid his face in his hands. The torture intensified. His skin bubbled and his muscles wasted on the bone. When he next opened his mouth, no sound came from it, and he fell prostrated before his enemy, crippled with agony. Nathaniel leaned forward, taking a delight in the pensioner's suffering. 1,000 daggers pierced Mr. Roper's flesh, and an army of stinging ants went creeping into the wounds. That was it. The old man lifted a trembling hand and pointed. "Kitchen," he whimpered. "Under the floor." And he slumped onto the carpet. "God forgive me," he blubbered. "Congratulations," Nathaniel said. "You lasted longer than many half your age." Stepping over him, he strolled casually into the kitchen, where, kneeling, he tugged at one corner of the faded linoleum. Under it were large flagstones, and upon one of them was a symbol of the crescent moon. Nathaniel held his breath with excitement. Hastily he fished in his pocket and brought out the plaster fragment. Sure enough, the mark corresponded to one of those inscribed there. Quickly he took a knife from the drawer and levered the flagstone up an inch. Then he slid his fingers underneath and lifted it clear. "It's empty!" His lip curled into a snarl. "Roper!" he shrieked. "Trick me, would you?" Down the dark ginnel Mr. Roper fled. He wasn't sure where he would go. He just had to escape. The memory of his agonies under Nathaniel still loomed large in his mind, and panting, he limped further into the echoing alley. Ribbons of grey mist swirled about his feet, whisking into turgid flurries as he staggered by, his frantic breath streaming from his mouth, and the blood sang in his ears. He must get free, away from that evil man, away to safety. Suddenly a cold, hard voice rang out. "Halt!" it commanded. Mr. Roper cried out in alarm. Horrified, he swayed back and forth, but his feet refused to take another step forward. "Keep away," Mr. Roper murmured. "Keep away." The Warlock strode closer. This time there would be no entertainment. "Where is the second guardian?" he demanded. Mr. Roper howled as a black sword seemed to pierce his skull. There was no resistance to that kind of mental power he had lost. "Ben," gurgled Mr. Roper helplessly. "Ben has it." "Then," said Nathaniel coldly, "I must have a nice chat with him, like the one we're having now." "Can't," wheezed Mr. Roper. "You can't attack him. He's touched the moon kelp, the only living creature apart from the deep ones who has. Your spells would be useless." Nathaniel gave a cruel little snort. Don't be too sure, old man, he spat. There are other methods at my disposal. A sickening smirk crept onto the Warlock's face. I have learned all I can here. You have my permission to die. Mr. Roper, keeper of the second guardian, perished in the cold mist. The vast shape of the cliff reared massive and black above Ben's head. Looking up, he saw that the great stone doors of the Aufweider caves were open wide, and many of the fisherfolk were gathered at the entrance with lanterns in their hands. Helped by Tar, Ben began to climb up the cliff face. Slowly they ascended until a number of weathered hands came grasping at the air above their heads. "Easy! Easy!" Nelda's grandfather shouted. "Humans ain't strong, dunna break him." Ben had seen it once before, but was still overawed by the size of the chamber. The main entrance to the Aufweider caves was cluttered with small boats and creels. Evidently some effort had been made to try and decorate the chamber, but the overall effect was a cheerless and disjointed hotchpotch. One of the sea wives who had helped Ben up brushed her hand against his cheek and murmured, "Oh, its skin is so soft." She gazed at the strange creature with wide eyes full of sadness and sobbed, "It's like a babe's." Several of the other females went over and comforted her. A desperate emptiness showed in all their faces. Quietly, Tar came up behind the boy. "Never you mind them," he whispered. "Remember the curse of the Lords of the Deep lies heavy on us all. No Ben's been born to us since Nelda." Ben turned to look at him and found that Tar, bluff as he was crying. The boy fell silent. If it wasn't for him, the mother's curse would have been lifted, and hope would have returned to the tribe. Tar coughed. "It's time," he said solemnly. "I'm go and fetch Nelda." He patted the boy on the back and limped from the entrance chamber. Only Prawny Nusk, a friend of old Tar, dared to smile benignly at the boy. "Over here," he beckoned. "Watch with me the tide creeping up the shore. She's filling the pools now. Won't be long, and then the poor lass'll be wed." "I don't understand," said Ben. "Doesn't Nelda want to get married?" Nusk shook his head. Only then did Ben understand Tar's unhappiness. Appalled, he stared out at the rising waters, feeling sick and cold. And that is the end of Side 2. Nelda stood still as stone near the entrance to her chamber. At that moment she was the most beautiful Aufweider ever to have lived. She was arrayed in a richly embroidered dress which all the womenfolk had been at pains to complete in time. It was a glorious blue-green colour that shimmered like the sea. It took 3 sea wives to fuss over and groom her in all her bridal finery: Old Parry, Maudlin Trauker, and a toothless crone known as Baccy. Maudlin heaved a great sigh. "Why," she said, "you'd outshine the moon kelp itself were it here." Old Parry snorted. "Pooh," she exclaimed. "If it were here, the girl wouldn't have to wed at all." Throughout all this, Nelda remained silent. She had let them primp and preen her, as was the custom, but that was all. She did not have to join in. "You're ready," Maudlin told her. "Nelda?" The bride-to-be blinked and stared round as if she'd been asleep. "You've done well," she told them. "Thank you." "Yep," yammered Baccy. "That's all trussed up like a fish supper, and Esau's the one who'll be feasting." And she dissolved into a fit of squawking cackles. Tar strode into the chamber. Nelda lifted her head and rushed over, flinging her arms about his neck. Tar shot the women a dangerous glance, and they hurried out of the chamber as fast as they could. Oh, grandfather," Nelda cried, weeping for the first time. "I'm so unhappy." "Lass," he answered, holding her close, "let me see thee. Why, thou's prettier than your grandmother ever were." And for several minutes they clung desperately to each other. Eventually, Tar pulled away. "'Tis time, lass," he said. She linked her arm in his. Out of the cave they went, out to where Nelda's doom awaited her. Ben was very cold, and his legs ached, for there was nowhere to sit down. He stared at the gurgling water below and watched it steadily rise. Prawny glanced back into the chamber, his face growing stern. "It begins," he muttered. Ben followed his stare. A hushed murmur ran through the Aufwaders as Esau entered the chamber, shambling slowly forward, putting all his decrepit weight on 2 gnarled sticks. He glared at the tribe, his crabbed face twisted into a sneer. Ben could not believe any living thing could be so old, and asked Prawny, "Who's that?" "Esau," came the bitter reply. "The bridegroom." Ben could feel nothing but revulsion at the sight of him. Esau raised his shrunken head, and when his beady eyes lit upon the boy, a foul curse issued from his hideous lips. Another rippling murmur bubbled through the gathering. Nelda had arrived. Her face was set in an awful, grim expression, but she held her head proudly and glided with a cold dignity smoothly through the chamber. Passing Ben, Nelda's eyes wavered, flicking from her husband-to-be to the boy. All she could do was nod and continue on her way. She stopped at Esau's side, where Tar reluctantly wrenched himself from her. Esau was regarding her with lustful eyes. He licked his lips and croaked. "Thou art indeed most fair, my love. Many gifts shall I shower upon thee. Much wisdom shall I share. Many secrets that I alone am privy to." And he gave her a lascivious wink. Nelda said nothing, but looked out to the shimmering waters. Esau pounded one of his sticks on the ground. "Let the briding commence," he declared. He pointed to the black horizon. "Under cover of stars and moon," he called, although there were none. A few of the fisherfolk raised their eyebrows at this. A proper ceremony usually only took place on clear nights, but Esau was too impatient to be denied now. "Under cover of stars and moon," he repeated, defying the traditions of his people, "do I, Esau Grendel, pledge mine intent to take for mine own Nelda Shrimp, and bestow upon her such gifts that are in my power. Hear me, ye lords of the deep and dark. Grant to thy loyal servants Esau and Nelda thine own blessing, that we may be sure of a merry life together hereafter." Once the prayer had been given, a female came forward bearing a strange loaf-shaped cake and a length of string. Esau took the cord and passed one end to Nelda, who slowly bound it around her wrist. Esau did the same. "Now we are tethered," he gurgled. "So shall it be," she said. Nelda broke off a piece of the bride cake and bit into it. All they had to do now was kiss, and the ceremony would be complete. With a quailing heart, Nelda bent down, and the ancient creature upturned his face. Both closed their eyes, one in repulsion, the other in ecstasy. "Look!" cried Prawny suddenly. "Out yonder, a light is shining." Ben glanced out to see. Sure enough, at the edge of the dark, watery world, a faint glimmer had appeared. At once everyone began to chatter in bewilderment and fear. Ben looked at Prawny. "What is it?" he asked. "Why is everyone so afraid?" "'Tis a sign from them," Nusk replied. Esau hissed, "We must not delay. Let the briding proceed." Grabbing hold of Nelda, he pulled her towards his puckered, waiting lips. But Tar intervened. "Us mun wait. We dursn't carry on till us knows what they are wanting." The light drew closer. Presently Ben could see that it was a small wooden boat and that a figure was seated in it. It seemed that the sea itself was drawing it forward. Ben stared in wonder. The boat was filled with clear water, and it was this that glowed. The light was silvery blue and fell on everyone's face. A long, jagged hole gaped in the hull and should have made it impossible to remain afloat. But there it was, upheld by the hand of the sea. The boy was amazed, and then the figure within commanded his complete attention. Dressed in a loose robe of sea green, a large hood concealed the face, and not even the shifting light could penetrate the black shadows beneath that cowl. In a hard, ringing voice it cried, "Esau Grendel, I am a messenger from the dark realm, sent hither by the three whom thy petty triad mirrors in dread." The fisherfolk were dismayed at these words, for they knew that the deep ones were angry with them. Only Esau remained undaunted. "In thy arrogance, thou hast called upon my masters to bless this unholy union. The lords of the deep and dark withhold their blessing and dispatched me with this warning: continue in this, and thou art doomed." Even Ben shivered at this, and he was aware of the terror that filled the rest of the cave. Esau raised one of his sticks and pointed it accusingly at the herald. "Take this reply back to thy cruel masters," he raged. "They have lost the right to interfere in our affairs. 'Tis their curse which we have suffered under. Must they refuse us a final happiness? They deny thee nothing, only a bride too young for thee." "Begone," Esau demanded. "I turn thee away as mine enemy. Tell that to thy masters, and may their thrones rot below the waves. I will have naught else to do with them." With an ominous rumble, the sea began to swell. As the boat sailed away, the waves crashed over the threshold of the entrance chamber, covering everyone in freezing salt water. "What hast thou done?" Tar cried. "Esau, thou hast angered them with thy haughty words. What possessed thee?" "Close the doors," Esau ordered. "They'll not fright me so easily." "Now," Esau cried, "'tis time to finish what was started." He dragged Nelda towards him and pressed his putrid lips against hers. "The deep ones," muttered Tar in dismay. "They forbade you." "They no longer have dominion here," proclaimed Esau. He cast a disgusted look at Ben and then said to Nelda, "I give thee a few moments with thy human friend, for it shall be the last time thou shalt ever see him." Shuffling off, he called over his shoulder, "Seek me in my chamber. There shall I be waiting." "This is what I feared," she told Ben. "Esau has forbidden me to leave the caves. I shall never see you or the daylight until he dies." And sobbing, she told him how she had been forced into the marriage. Ben's heart sank. So this, too, was his fault. "I'm sorry," he told her. The Aufwader shook her head. "It was my own rash promise that led me to this," she said. "But if I hadn't been got at by Rowena—" Then he remembered Nathaniel and knew this was his only chance to tell her about what had happened. Quickly he explained all that he knew, and Nelda listened with great interest, especially the part about Earl and the first guardian he had made. "Never have I heard of such a thing," she murmured when he was done. He must have hid it well indeed. What of you, grandfather? Tar frowned. When I were a lad, he began, I recall talk of somewhat wicked sleeping in the dark, but note of any guardian. There's only one in the tribe who might know of it. Nelda knew who he meant. Esau, she breathed. If this is as important as you say, she said to Ben, then I will do what I can. She gave Ben a hug. Goodbye, my friend, she said sorrowfully. Remember me. Goodbye, sniffed Ben. The outwader waved farewell and disappeared into the tunnel. Leaning on his staff, Tar sucked his teeth thoughtfully. Don't you go a-frettin', he told the boy. I'll keep thee abreast of the news and bring you messages from my granddaughter. Come now, I'll lead thee back to thy world. Esau sat on his bunk, stroking the bedclothes dreamily. Only the eldest of the tribe was ever allowed in this cavern. It was a large place lying beyond the throne room. Its most unusual feature was a circular pool set into the rocky floor. It was filled with black water, the surface of which was smooth as glass. The curtain which hung over the doorway was drawn aside, and Nelda peered in. Welcome, my beauty, Esau said eagerly. Step into thy new home. Nelda wandered about the cave, looking at everything with interest. No, my rosebud, he cried warningly, don't touch that. Having seen the pool, she had knelt beside it, curious at the stillness of the water. Promise me, my bloom of the deep, that thou shalt never touch that pool. He stared down into the jet water as he explained. My dark mirror, I call it, he breathed. If I gaze long enough into its black heart, 1,000 sights can be seen of the world that was, and what the world may be. 'Tis the great secret of our tribe, and only the leader of the triad may use it. So leave well alone, my sweet wife. I shall, she answered. Esau smiled, obviously relieved. Limping over to the bunk, he patted the blankets expectantly. Oh, no, Nelda cried defiantly. A companion only shall I be. Dragging the bedclothes from the bunk, she strode into a warm corner and made herself comfortable. Good night, she said curtly. Esau glowered. Curse you, raged Esau. But the girl took no further notice of him and closed her eyes. The storm was raging savagely against the cliff. On the sands by the pier, Nathaniel Crozier regarded the tempest with interest. It would seem the deep ones have been stirred to fury, he told himself. Clutching the plastic bag, he resumed his work. Stooping, he looked into the carrier. It was bloated with offal and gory shreds of liver. I hope this is what it's partial to, he muttered. By the pier wall, a wide outlet pipe opened onto the sand. Nathaniel inspected it carefully. The grill which had covered it had been torn away. Whistling softly, he dipped into the bag and threw a bloody piece of meat into the dark drain. Come on, my little beastie, he chuckled. Another gruesome piece of flesh was thrown, followed by another, until a short trail had been made leading from the opening onto the shore. Then he waited. A furtive snuffling echoed from the pipe, followed by noisy chewing. Nathaniel smirked. Not long now. If he could only look into its eyes. There came an agitated scuffling, as though whatever it was could not decide whether to venture out or not. But the scent of the blood was too delicious. Cats no longer satiated its hunger, and it craved for sweeter, plumper meat. It was too much. The creature could bear it no longer and crept cautiously out. Nathaniel was fascinated. As the fish demon slowly emerged from the outlet, he marveled at its ugliness. The last of the malekins crawled warily forward, then lunged ravenously at the slimy entrails which glistened on the sand. Bon appetit, the Warlock said. The creature glared up at him and scampered back to the mouth of the drain. "Stop," Nathaniel commanded. "You need not fear me. I shall not hurt you." At once the fish demon froze, its primitive mind utterly dominated by the Warlock's will. "Excellent," Nathaniel cooed, patting the foul monster on the side of its head. "If you serve me well, you shall gorge on daintier meat than cats and butchers' leftovers." Miss Boston was annoyed. She had not been allowed to see Patricia Gunning since the day of her arrival in London. This morning she had knocked at the sick-room door only to have the nurse bark out that the patient was not up to seeing anyone. So the old lady wandered downstairs and discovered that there was no breakfast ready for her. Rook, the butler, was still in his bed with a severe hangover. Drawing back the curtains of his room, she declared that he needn't bother cooking her any more meals. She would do it herself. "Really," she clucked, looking at the stack of empty bottles which lay about the place. The kitchen, when she discovered it, was in a frightful state. Rolling up the sleeves of her blouse, she announced to the filthy kitchen that she was not going to stand for this any longer. By lunchtime, she was sitting down at the spotless kitchen table, eating her breakfast. When she had finished her meal, she went upstairs once more to see if her friend was any better. On the landing outside the sick room, she came to a halt. Judith Deacon was waiting, with her back squarely against the door. The old lady forced a smile to her lips. "Good afternoon," she began as brightly as she could. "May I slip in and see Patricia now?" "No," the nurse snapped. "You cannot see her until I consider her to be strong enough." "And when might that be?" "Perhaps this evening, or perhaps tomorrow." And so Miss Boston spent the rest of the afternoon in the Natural History Museum, but her mind kept returning to the mysterious goings-on in that house. She felt sure that Patricia needed the help of a real doctor, but she had promised her that she wouldn't interfere. When she returned, the house was quiet and dark. It seemed that Rook had recovered enough to raid the cellar once more, and had selected a rather good bottle of port, which was warming him very nicely. At 8 o'clock she knocked on the sick-room door. A deep voice told her to go away, and Miss Boston stamped her foot in annoyance before trudging up to her own room, furious and irritated. "Alice Boston," she said, "there's something very wrong here, and I'm ashamed that you haven't done anything about it yet. That Deacon woman's up to some villainy, and poor Patricia is at her mercy." Just then a noise sounded outside her door. "Who's there?" Miss Boston demanded. "Alice," came a weak voice. Into the room came a skeletal figure, its silver hair streaming behind. "Patricia!" exclaimed Miss Boston. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Gunning collapsed on the bed. She looked terrible. Across the left side of her face was a disgusting yellowish bruise. "Alice," she said, "forgive me." "Patricia!" Miss Boston cried. "I couldn't stop her," Patricia explained with difficulty. "It was all her doing." "The nurse?" asked Miss Boston, her temper boiling. "How dare she?" The old lady strode purposefully to the door. "I'm going to call the police," she declared. "No," Patricia begged. "There isn't time for that, please. Alice, come here." Such was the urgency in the voice that Miss Boston hurried back to her. "But she could have killed you," she said. Mrs. Gunning shook her head in despair. "She already has, Alice," she whispered. "I won't last the night. Don't say that." "No, listen to me," she implored. "Deacon has been poisoning me for weeks now. I was never seriously ill. That only happened when she arrived. She's evil, Alice. You must get away from here." "I'm not leaving," cried Miss Boston. "That nurse doesn't frighten me." "Then she ought to," wept Mrs. Gunning. "You don't know what she's capable of. An evil force drives her. She is... she is darkness itself." A fit of coughing made it impossible for her to continue, and when it subsided, there was blood on her lips. Patricia shuddered. "You must go, Alice," she cried. "Back to Whitby, where you belong. I was the lure, Alice," she breathed desolately. "But," the other murmured, "what for?" "Something is happening in Whitby," Patricia said. "Something totally evil. They couldn't risk you being there to interfere with their plans." "They?" "I don't know who else is involved, only that you were to be kept away from Whitby at all costs." Miss Boston slowly rose, her mind filled with apprehensions. "The children," she muttered. "You must go back to them, Alice," urged Mrs. Gunning. "But what about you?" "I don't matter anymore." Mrs. Gunning shifted on the bed. Hidden beneath the folds of her nightdress was a squarish bundle, and she brought it out, thrusting it into Miss Boston's hands. The old lady took it, and a tear fell down her face. "Your book of shadows," she said sorrowfully. "A witch's most valuable possession," coughed Mrs. Gunning. "All my knowledge, everything that I knew about the craft." She gasped as the pain increased, and Miss Boston knelt to hold her. "Deacon never found it," she choked. "Always searched, though. Beware her, Alice. Take care of my book. Take care of the children. And forgive me." The frail woman let out a long, agonized breath and died in Miss Boston's arms. Miss Boston kissed her dear friend goodbye. For some minutes she didn't move, too overcome by grief to do anything. Then, as she collected herself, she gently lifted the body and laid Patricia on the bed. "Come on, Alice," she said. "Pull yourself together." Still clasping Patricia's book, she scurried from the room. In her bare feet, she hurried down to the first-floor landing. Stepping carefully past the sick room, the old lady hastened for the alcove where a telephone stood upon a small table. Gingerly, she lifted the receiver. Not a sound came from the earpiece. The line was dead. Miss Boston slowly turned. "You," she muttered. Standing on the landing was Judith Deacon. Dangling limply from her hands was the severed telephone cord. "I couldn't permit that," she growled. "Where is Mrs. Gunning? She was very naughty flitting off like that." "Patricia's dead," the old lady told her accusingly. "And as soon as I get in touch with the constabulary, I shall tell them exactly what you've done." The nurse laughed. "Do you think I'd really let you get out of here alive?" she cried. Miss Boston edged backwards. "You're insane," she shouted. "You'll never get away with it. All I have to do is call for Rook." "The butler?" hooted Judith in derision. "He'll be well pickled by now. There'll be no help from him tonight." She prowled a little nearer. The rail of the landing banister pressed into Miss Boston's back, and she knew she could not escape. "You poisoned and beat her. What sort of animal are you?" Judith struck the old lady on the cheek. "If I am an animal," the nurse seethed, "then I'm a proud one. Now my beloved will be pleased with me. I have done all he asked. I see Mrs. Gunning has given you her Book of Shadows. How considerate. Your beloved, stammered Miss Boston. The most enthralling man I have ever known, she said huskily. Nathaniel Crozier. For him I would do anything. He is why I breathe. Crozier, repeated Miss Boston. But that's the man staying next door to my cottage. Miss Deacon tossed her head. That's right, you foul old crone, she cried. That's my darling Nathaniel. Was it a trick of the light, or were the nurse's eyebrows really growing thicker, bristling over the bridge of her nose and spiking up to her temples? Crozier, Miss Boston said again. She grasped the banister for support, then remembered at last where she had first heard that name. "Oh, my Lord!" she cried. Judith screeched with hellish laughter, and the old lady cowered away, tipping dangerously back over the rail. She felt her head spin, and from her grasp slipped the Book of Shadows. It crashed onto the marble and exploded, pages flying everywhere. Judith Deacon's eyes blazed with unquenchable malice. She seized the old lady's throat with her hands, and even as she grappled with her, the strong fingers mutated into claws, and black fur crept down her fleshy arms. Miss Boston felt the hound's hot breath against her exposed throat. This was the end. She who had saved the world from Rowena Cooper could not save herself. A scream rent the still calm of the night. It pierced the darkness for a brief instant, then was silenced forever. Ben yawned and peered out of the window. Then the memories of last night came flooding back and banished all lingering traces of sleep. Quickly the boy dressed and ran downstairs to the kitchen. With a jangling of keys, the front door was meekly opened, and Miss Weathers entered, blowing her nose. Her eyes were red raw, and her spectacles splashed with tears. She blubbered. "Oh, that lovely old gentleman. Found outside his house, poor dear thing. He was so polite." "Who do you mean?" asked Ben, raising his head. Edith bit her lip. Oh, Benjamin," she wept. It's Mr. Roper. He's gone to heaven, dear." The boy staggered from his seat. "No," he shouted. "No!" "Ben!" Jennet cried as her brother dashed from the kitchen and fled upstairs. "No, let him go," Edith advised in between her sniffles. "Poor boy. Oh, I really don't know what to do. I tried to ring Alice, but the London number she gave me is quite dead." Ben hurled himself onto the bed and buried his face in the pillow. He had loved that lonely old man. It was as if everyone he met was snatched away. First Mum and Dad, then the foster parents who didn't want him. Now Nelda was forbidden to see him. And finally this. Even Jennet was acting strangely these days. Rolling over, the dejected boy stared in anguish at the ceiling. Then he remembered the fireworks. Hastily, he dragged the tin from under the chest of drawers. They were extremely precious to him now, a parting gift from that kindly old man. Reverently, he removed the lid and gazed within. A riot of color met his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, taking each of the brightly patterned fireworks out and examining them in turn. "I won't forget you," he said softly, as he noticed a lining of brown paper that covered the bottom. Curiously, the boy lifted the paper out and discovered that it was actually a flat parcel. Unwrapping it carefully, he found inside a bag of faded crimson velvet. Holding his breath, he untied the neck of the bag and pulled out the treasure within. At once he realized what Mr. Roper had given to him. It was a tablet of dark-stained wood. In the middle was a series of round images depicting the cycle of the moon, and all were inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Around this was a twisting border that had once been covered in gold leaf. The boy could feel its power tingling through his fingers. "The second guardian," he whispered. "Then it was his family who kept it all this time." And as he stared, an awful certainty gradually dawned. Nathaniel had killed the old man. Hurriedly, Ben shoved the wooden tablet back into the container. He had to make sure that evil man didn't get his hands on this guardian. It was time to tell his sister. Jennet must be made to understand what Mr. Crozier was really like. Ben ran downstairs. "Jen," he said urgently, "you've got to listen to me. I know how Mr. Roper died. That Crozier did it. Mr. Roper was keeping something he wanted, and he killed him for it." Jennet's face assumed an ugly, angry look. "Shut up," she demanded. "How dare you say that? You've never liked Nathaniel. You're just jealous, that's it." "Jealous?" he mumbled. "What of?" "Of him," she cried. "Of him and me, that's what. You don't like him because of what we mean to one another." "You're mad," Ben told her. "If you could only hear yourself." Jennet shifted on the chair, but a brisk knock on the front door silenced whatever else she was going to say. "Hello?" came a voice. "Anybody home?" The girl sprang from the seat in delight. "Nathaniel! I'm coming!" "No!" cried Ben. "You mustn't let him in. He wants the second guardian. Jen, don't!" Ben saw the Warlock stride into the hallway and kiss his sister on the cheek. But then his blood froze in his veins and his forehead was pricked with sweat. Into the house, close on the heels of Nathaniel, hopped the most detestable creature the boy had ever seen. Helplessly he watched as the fish demon waddled through the hall, its mouth stained with dried blood and its fins flexing in curiosity. "Ah," Nathaniel said with feigned courtesy, "I see the amusingly bad-mannered Benji is here also." For a moment he towered above him, then put a finger to his lips, warning Ben to say nothing in front of his sister. But the boy was unable to speak, so frightened was he by the fish demon. Nathaniel smiled smugly and sat in the chair. He was totally in control and savoured his authority. With a hollow purr, the malekin curled up round his feet. "Say hello, Ben," said Jennet, sitting on the sofa. "Can't you see it?" Ben asked. Jennet gave him a puzzled look. "Don't start that again," she warned him. "Honestly, Nathaniel, before you arrived, he was talking the most ridiculous drivel." The Warlock pretended to listen attentively to her, but his dark eyes were on Ben the whole time, malice flowing steadily from them. He tapped his fingers on the chair, and at once the malekin lurched to its clawed feet and advanced towards the unwitting girl. Ben started forward, but the creature hissed at him and began pacing around her threateningly. The malekin spread its claws wide and twined them in Jennet's hair. The girl gave a flick of her hand, thinking a fly was tangled there. Nathaniel grinned horribly and said, "Jennet, be a good little love and make me a cup of tea." "Of course," she said, only too willing to serve him. She left the room, and the fish demon toddled fiendishly behind her. "Well, boy, what do you think of my pet?" "It's just the sort I'd expect you to have," Ben replied, sounding braver than he actually felt. "If anything happens to Jen," he muttered. "No need to be concerned," the Warlock assured him. "The little fellow is entirely under my control." "It was you who killed Mr. Roper, wasn't it?" he accused. Nathaniel beamed. "The old fool was too stubborn for his own good. I do hope you're not going to make the same mistake." Ben had had enough. "Call your monster in here," he demanded. "Get it away from my sister." "Tut, tut," remarked Nathaniel in disappointment. "Now that isn't how it works, is it? You give me what I want, and I spare pretty little Jennet." Faced with this terrible dilemma, the boy had no option but to fetch the second guardian from his room. He handed the velvet bag over, and the man snatched it from him. "At last!" last, he breathed, thrusting it into his jacket pocket. A wise decision, boy. What will you do? Ben asked. Will you destroy it like you did the one in the church? You must already know the answer to that. All the guardians must be dispensed with. There's only one more to find now, isn't there? Ben said. Well, you won't find it. Even the fisherfolk don't know where it is. We'll see about that, Nathaniel spat in annoyance. A cat is a useful pet, my lad. Set it amongst pigeons and any resistance is rapidly quashed. What do you mean? The Warlock laughed wickedly. How strong do you think the outriders are, child? Are they prepared for a confrontation with my little demon? He'll set them bolting down their filthy holes, and it won't be long before the guardian made by Earl is uncovered. Ben was horrified. You can't let that thing loose down there, he cried. The fisherfolk would all be killed. They won't be able to defend themselves. Ben, said Jennet, coming in with the tea and a plate of biscuits. What are you going on about now? I hope he hasn't been bothering you, she said, throwing Ben a moody glance. Nathaniel twitched his fingers, and the fish demon capered over to rest at his feet again. Not at all, he answered. Back at Mrs. Gregson's, Nathaniel stood in front of the blazing fire. He took the second guardian from his jacket and turned it over in his hands. That's pretty, Mrs. Gregson ventured. Antique, is it? Priceless, he informed her. What a painstaking, lovely piece of art. So very, very exquisite and infinitely precious. With that, he let the wooden tablet fall from his fingers and crash into the fire below. A blinding light burst from the hearth, blowing soot and flames into the living room. Mrs. Gregson shrieked in fright, but Nathaniel watched gleefully as a tremendous rush of golden sparks soared up the chimney. The woman stared dumbly at him. Then the room grew dark. What's happening? She whimpered. In his hand, Nathaniel held the plaster fragment where the sign of the crescent moon glowed briefly and was gone. Beside the mark of Hilda, only one other symbol remained. Night has come early to Whitby, the Warlock muttered. Rushing to the window, Mrs. Gregson cried, It's as if the sun has died. An ominous tremor rumbled beneath the cliff, shaking its very foundations. It's an earthquake, she howled at Nathaniel. You've done this. Make it stop. Make it stop. But the Warlock was too thrilled to hear her. It was starting already. It was waking. Ben staggered over the quaking shore, where the threshing sand swirled in choking clouds. Nelda, he shouted as he clambered over boulders and leapt over gaping trenches. Can you hear me? Anyone? Ben paddled to the secret entrance of the Aufwader caves and shouted up at the hidden doors. Hello, he called desperately. You must listen. If only he could warn them before it was too late. Is the addled lad? There's all wet. Ta! Ben cried, greatly relieved to see him. I've got to talk to you. It's urgent. The Aufwader ambled forward. What's he blethering about now? He grumbled. It's that Crozier, the boy explained, hurrying towards him. He's got a disgusting creature working for him now. He says he's going to let it loose in your caves. The Aufwader listened to him gravely. Nah, he said. There's nought that can get in our tunnels without our letting it. We'll be safe if the cliff don't fall about our ears, that is. Did I feel the land shifting afore? Ain't never done that in all my days. But that was Crozier's fault, Ben exclaimed. He's got the second guardian. Probably destroyed it by now. Goodness knows what'll happen if he gets hold of the last one. Does thou truly reckon this Crozier fella is to blame for this? We thought it were the deep ones still angry with us. But perhaps not. He turned a fearful face to the boy and added, If that man can do this, ain't no he can't do. You must warn the others, Ben urged. He'll send in his creature, and if they're not ready, the entire tribe will be killed. Tar let out a defiant shout, drove his staff into the soft moss and spun around. Oh, us'll be ready, lad, he called. Have no fear on that. We'll be waiting all right. The old Aufwader marched down the caves, dragging aside the entrance curtains of the living quarters and shouting at those within. Fetch the others, he commanded. There's mortal danger headed our way. Find what weapons they can. Sticks, hooks, knives, out. Then guard the entrances and keep watch. What we watching for? Asked old Prawny huffily. If thou finds it, thou'll know, Tar replied darkly. It'll tear thee limb from limb. Go cover every hole with net and stand by them to be sure. If this devil does break through, there won't be none of us left. Down the steep osier stair went Tar. The earth tremor had loosened some of the steps, and now they rocked perilously under his weight. Grimly he reflected that they would not withstand a second violent quake. Hurriedly the Aufwader ducked under a low, protruding rib-cage and came finally to the gibbering road. The slender bridge was wreathed in mist, shimmering behind towering columns of dense smoke. It was an ethereal arch that linked one world to another, but was present in neither. Holding his staff before him, Tar tapped it against the rock and slowly groped forward. Nervously he stretched out a foot and tested the strength of the stone. There was no telling what the earthquake had done to the gibbering road. Tar, shrimp, called a cold, cracked voice. Tar faltered, and his foot slipped on the wet rock. He leapt back from the deadly bridge in fright. Return to the upper caves, demanded the voice. The tribe have need of thee. Tar thrashed his staff through the thick vapor. I know thee, he cried. Come out of the smoke, Esau, where I can see thee. At that moment the columns of steam subsided, and the Aufwader caught a glimpse of the far side of the chasm. Leaning on 2 sticks and bent almost double was the leader of the triad. At his side stood Nelda. Her face was pale, and she called to her grandfather in dismay. Be careful, she cried. He'll kill you if you try to cross. Esau whipped round and slapped her. Silence, he roared. I did not give thee leave to speak. Hoy, bellowed Tar furiously. Keep thy hands off her. Esau turned back to him. Begone, he wailed. The upper world is thine now, shrimp. I do relinquish my sovereignty there. Let my bride and me be at peace from it all. The years of the tribe are numbered. Only hours remain to you now. A beast is coming, a demon from the dawn of days, and you shall wither before it like ice in flame. How dost thou know? Yelled Tar. Never shalt thou learn the answer to that, Esau shrieked. Flee whilst thou may, Tar shrimp, for even now the malekin pries and pokes upon the cliff. Then thou must help us, Tar shouted. There is a way, the human boy told me. Where is the guardian made by Earl? Thou ought not to listen to the land breed, spat Esau. There never was any guardian. Earl wrought nothing with the moon kelp he stole. Dragging himself away from the edge of the precipice, he called out, Now shall my wife and me withdraw into this small realm. The lords of the deep no longer hold sway over our lives here. Casting a malevolent glance at Nelda, signaling her to follow, Esau hobbled away. Grandfather, Nelda called. Did you really see Ben? Aye, lass, came the reply, but greatly troubled he was. This guardian is important, isn't it? Oh, Nelda, Tar cried. It's all ending. At last Nelda knew what must be done. The lives of everyone she held dear were in her hands. Only she could save them. At that moment, the girl came to a horrendous decision. "Goodbye, grandfather," she said. But her voice was thin and weak, and he did not hear her. Nelda moved as though she were in a dream. Her feet led her to the hallowed cavern. Slowly she drew aside the tapestry curtain and made her way into the triad chamber. The light from the lamp above the central throne flickered sharply over her small form. The rock crystal about the silver boat shone like the moon on the waves. Nelda raised her eyes to it and found herself wondering who had created the cunning lamp. Could Earl's hands have formed the silver timbers? And could he have hewn the crystal from the cliff? The idea grew large in her mind, and she strode quickly to her husband's chamber to confirm it. And that is the end of side 3. Esau was hunched over the pool, searching for answers to appease his gnawing doubts. He did not see his bride enter the chamber. Below him the pool pulsed with a dismal glow, and Esau clasped his gnarled claws as faint images swam into view. There was Tar trudging back through the tunnels. Then the vision changed, and a flash of scales leaped through the dark, and for a moment the pool was blank. Esau's lips parted. "More," he jabbered. "I must see more." In the inky pool an image of the cliff top formed, and there, standing amid the gravestones, was Nathaniel Crozier. He looked up. It was as though he could see the ancient Aufwader, for he raised his hand and pointed threateningly. Then he dissolved. The pool sank into blackness once more. Esau let out a rattling breath, tired and weary from his mental exertions. Lowering his head like an animal at a pond, he lapped the surface, making a disgusting, sucking noise. "What are you doing?" asked Nelda, repulsed. Her husband flew backwards, his mouth dripping with oily liquid. She looked at the elder uncertainly, then prepared herself for the task that lay ahead. "Husband," she began, "my grandfather's words have frightened me." Esau wiped the slime from his lips. "Save thy sorrow," he told her. "But I cannot," she wept. "Poor sweet wife," he muttered. "Thou art indeed afraid. Have no fear. Whitby is safe. I promise you that." Nelda stared at him. "How can you be sure?" "Trust in my wisdom," he cackled. "I am certain because the last protector is safe. No harm will come if it remains where it resides." "Then the guardian does exist. Tell me where it is," Nelda begged. "Please." Esau gave her a covetous glance, then turned his back and ambled over to the bed. Nelda ran after him. "If I guess," she said, "would you tell me if I was right?" The elder hauled himself onto the bunk. "I might," he muttered. "Then the lamp," Nelda declared. "The one above your throne. Earl made it, didn't he?" Esau chortled wickedly. "Indeed," he mumbled. Nelda made to run. She had to take the guardian away from danger. The malekin would soon be here to seize it and deliver it to its master. "But that is not the device Earl made to keep Morgaurus at bay," Esau revealed slyly. The girl froze. "Morgaurus?" she repeated. Her husband nuzzled his head into the blankets. "The dreaded one," he softly chanted. "That which spreads disease and anguish. that which the deep ones overthrew in the beginnings of time, and who sleeps beneath us even now, whose slumbering groans rise up from the deep chasm under the bridge of stone." "The gibbering road," said Nelda. "Then it is not the souls of the dead who cry out." Esau shook his head. "No, my love," he told her. "The shrieks are but proof of the weakening enchantment. But have no fear. The spells will hold whilst Earl's guardian remains in place." Nelda edged towards him. "Where is it?" she asked again. He giggled insanely and scrutinized her closely, then asked, "What sacrifice wouldst thou make, my bride?" "I would do anything to save the tribe," she sobbed. Her husband gave a low guttural chortle. "Then I have decided to tell thee," he said, "on one condition." At the east gate, 3 Aufwaders hammered fishing nets into position, resting only when the entrance was completely covered. "That's right," Brawny told them. "Now guard it with your lives. At the first sound of folk moving inside, give a shout and stand on guard." Leaving them to it, Brawny hurried further down the tunnel to check on the rest of the defences. "Steel yourself, Nusk," he said, keeping a firm hold of the cudgel in his hand. "You don't want to be found lacking when the time comes." Ducking beneath a low archway, he stepped onto a narrow path that steadily climbed. It was the only entrance he hadn't yet visited to oversee the defences, but knew that 4 of the tribe had gone to make sure the gate was closed. At a fork in the passage, he stopped and listened. Something was wrong. A muffled scraping was coming from above his head. As yet it was faint and indistinct, but with every beating second it grew nearer. This was it. They had been wrong to assume the enemy would enter by one of the main gates. It was making its own way in. With a dull clatter, a fistful of soil showered down upon his head. Suddenly a large clod of soil was kicked from above, and a mouth-shaped hole gaped down at him from the ceiling. Brawny trembled. "No!" he breathed in horror. Out of the darkness came a squat, misshapen head, and a pair of luminous eyes gazed balefully at him. Keeping its grim stare fixed steadily upon him, the fish demon crawled out. "No, you don't!" Brawny shouted, swinging his cudgel round in his panic. At once the scaly claws flashed out, seized the weapon, and hurled it far from reach. "Help!" Brawny screamed. "It's here! Help me!" Before he could run, the malekin hauled him up to where his screams ended abruptly, and all his struggles were over. Onto the tunnel floor the fiend dropped. The delightful fragrance of fear filled the caves. Emitting a horrible screech, it bounded down the passage, Brawny Nusk's blood still dripping from its jaws. Nelda struggled back into her ganzi, shivering with a cold sickness in her stomach. Esau was lying asleep on the bed beside her. For the sake of all, she had sacrificed and suffered much. But now that was over. Only the future mattered. Stealthily she approached the still pool and slipped her hand into the black water. The liquid was horribly cold. A putrid smell issued up from the disturbed sediment. Just when she thought despair would overwhelm her, her fingertips touched something amid the freezing ooze. Trembling, the Aufwader drew from the stagnant water the guardian Earl had made. It was made of jet, but the carving was a monstrous, twisting shape, fashioned in the form of a hideous serpent. The eyes of the serpent were closed, but beneath the lids something golden glimmered. moon kelp, she breathed. The coils of the jet beast were twined about the symbol of the Lords of the Deep, and behind the gruesome head Earl had inscribed these words: "By powers of the greater triad do I commit this guardian. May the bonds of enchantment bind the enemy evermore, and keep Morgaurus tethered in the dark." With a last contemptuous look at her husband, Nelda fled from the chamber, hugging the guardian to her breast. The upper levels of the cave were in uproar. The fish demon had breached the defenses, and already 7 fisherfolk had fallen before its vicious claws. "On!" thundered Tar, leading a small band through the dim halls to the upper levels. "It must be killed!" The others were horribly afraid, but he drove them on by the force of his voice and his commanding will. The creature had to be stopped. This coast was theirs by right, and only the Lords of the Deep could take it from them. Certainly no base fiend from the ancient world. A bright silver arc sliced through the gloom, and an Aufwader fell dead to the ground. The enemy had found them. A second furious sweep of its claws threw 2 others to the floor. "That's for prawn!" Tar roared, striking out with his staff and catching the malekin across the neck. Maddened and yowling in agony, the fish demon pounced, baited into a terrible rage that nothing could withstand. All it craved was to drink its bloated fill of hot blood. A string of saliva oozed from the open jaws, and a joyous gurgle bubbled from its flapping stomach. "Leave them!" rang the voice of Nathaniel suddenly. The fish demon whipped about. Where was he? "Seek out the leader," the Warlock demanded. "Your appetite can be satisfied later." The fish demon let out a confused whine. The voice was inside its head. "Down to the lower caves," the voice declared. "You shall find him there. Now go!" With a final hiss, it disappeared into the blackness of the caverns beyond. Tar groaned and coughed. His neck was clawed and bleeding. "Where is it?" he choked. "Don't let it get away." But the others had had enough. Their spirits were completely quashed, and their faces betrayed the sickness in their hearts. "Grandfather," came a voice. "Grandfather, where are you?" "Nelda!" Tar shouted, and the flame of hope burned brightly in his breast once more. Running from the shadows of the far passageway, the girl raced towards him. She stared at the claw marks at his throat, then saw for the first time the fallen tribe members. "I'm too late," she wept. "Is everyone dead? Did the creature kill them all?" "Not all," Tar muttered. "He's gone to the lower cave." "Esau," Nelda whispered. "It's gone for him. That's where the guardian was. That's what it wants. But I've got it here." She showed him the jet carving. "Oh, lass," he whispered. "How did they get the old goat to give it up?" Nelda said nothing, but she lowered her eyes, and he held her tightly. "Well, you mun get it out of here," he told her quickly. "But what shall I do with it?" she asked. Tar glanced up the tunnel. "Take it to thy human friend," he instructed. Nelda hugged him. "Promise me you'll leave as soon as everyone's been found." "I swear, lass," he told her. Clenching the guardian closely to her, Nelda darted up the passage. "Now," Tar muttered, brandishing the knife fiercely. "I'm gonna make that beastie squeal if it's the last thing I do." Esau gave a complaining groan as his blissful sleep became increasingly troubled. "Nelda," he burbled. With a jolt he awoke. Framed within the low doorway was the hideously deformed figure. "The malekin," Esau croaked. "How did it reach the lower realm?" Snarling, the creature took a prowling step closer. Nelda's husband staggered across the chamber. He had to escape it. Then Esau noticed the pool, and his legs collapsed under him. His dark mirror was swirling. "Curse thee, Nelda!" he screeched. "Thou hast sealed all our fates. The guardian of Earl ought not to have been moved. Couldst thou not guess the reason? Didst thou not see what the dark mirror is? What hast thou done?" The pool churned as a huge eye blinked open in the chamber floor. Esau tore at his beard. The dark slit of the pupil glared up at the insignificant Aufwader. Its terrible glance rooted Esau to the spot, and a hellish light shone angrily through the stagnant tears, tears which he in his folly had drunk to gain wisdom, but which had driven him insane. "Morgaurus," he gabbled. The cavern trembled as the gigantic enemy of the world twisted its buried head. This was where the Deep Ones had imprisoned it many thousands of years ago, trapped beneath the cliffs of Whitby to sleep out eternity under their enchantments. Into the sizzling light of its eye crept the fish demon. Gurgling with delight, it flew at Esau and slew him. Then the cavern shook suddenly, and the livid green slit of the pupil swiveled round at the bottom of the pool. At once the rock shuddered with cataclysmic violence. "Get out of there," commanded the voice of Nathaniel in the malekin's head. "Return to me." Shrieking, the fish demon bounded from the cavern as the ornately decorated roof buckled and quivered. Out through the triad chamber the malekin fled, and the 3 thrones toppled in ruins at its heels. The silver lamp was smashed, and the crystal waves it rode upon shivered into glittering dust. The gibbering road reared up before the squealing creature, and the fish demon threw itself onto the treacherously narrow way and began pattering hastily across. In the black gorge far below, Morgaurus slithered, and a tremendous roar blasted up from the invisible depths. The gibbering road flew apart, and emitting a terrified squeal, the last of the malekins toppled. A monstrous black fin stretched up from the abyss as Morgaurus started to uncoil. In claps of deafening thunder, the sheer walls were destroyed, and amid clouds of engulfing dust, they slid into the evil darkness. The end had indeed come. A grotesque, unnatural night covered Whitby. In the harbour the water boiled, and steam mingled with the dark, forming putrid clouds that rolled over the quayside and poured into the town. Upon the shore Ben watched as the 2 halves of Whitby were gradually eclipsed by the creeping shade. "Jen," the boy murmured as the dense black fog swallowed Church Street. He knew he had to get back. He should be with his sister. Then he froze. Out of the many secret entrances poured the surviving members of the Aufwader tribe. Ben hurried over to the cliff face and shouted to them. "What's happened?" he called. "Where's Tar? Is Nelda safe?" A bedraggled company stumbled out onto the rocks. Only one of them turned to look at the boy. "The tribe is finished," he spat. "This is the fault of your kind." Close behind, Nelda saw them. "I have it!" she cried, brandishing the last guardian for him to see. "How did you find it?" he asked when she pressed it into his hands. Nelda shivered and said quickly, "What matters now is we make certain the guardian is safe." The 2 of them haired over the shore and plunged into the blanketing murk. High upon the cliff-top, amid the tombstones, a solitary figure stood, his coal-black eyes penetrating the mounting gloom. "So," Nathaniel softly uttered, "the cave maiden stole it, did she? Then all is not lost. If I have to risk the fury of the Deep Ones, then so be it. The boy must die. I'll snap his neck myself." Hurrying through the graveyard, he leapt down the steps. With a lurch, Ben tumbled into the cottage, and Nelda nipped in behind. "I've been going out of my mind with worry," Miss Weathers scolded him. You should have come back as soon as the tanker exploded." "What tanker?" Ben asked. Miss Weathers fluttered her hands in consternation. "Well, something exploded," she declared, seeking a rational explanation for the chaos that had engulfed the town. "It isn't anything like that," the boy tried to tell her. "This is Nathaniel's doing. He's destroyed 2 of the—" But the postmistress was not listening to him. "Come into the parlour, Benjamin," she said. "The windows are all intact there, thank heavens." In the parlour the curtains had been drawn and several candles burned brightly. On the armchair sat Jennet. Her face was sullen. "I heard what you said," she muttered coldly. "Leave Nathaniel alone. He's out there too." "Jennet," Ben said. "Nelda's here. The tribe's been driven from the caves and most of the tunnels have collapsed." "Benjamin," squeaked Miss Weathers, "what are you talking about?" "The fisher folk," he told her, wanting to scream in frustration. Miss Weathers stared at him. "Oh dear," she whined. "It's the pollution. It's affected his brain." "We waste our time," Nelda said. "Show her the Guardian. She will have to believe you then." "Look," Ben cried. "This is the last protector of Whitby, made by one of the fisher folk thousands of years ago." Edith gazed at the jet serpent. Even Jennet leaned forward. "My," muttered Miss Weathers fearfully. "Wherever did you find such a gruesome object?" "I didn't," he told her, looking across at Jennet. "Nelda did." "Crozier wants it," Ben continued. "He's already destroyed the other 2. That's why all this is happening. Something is waking, and it's all that man's fault. It'll destroy everything if it gets free." That was too much for Jennet. She pounced at her brother, shoving him to the floor. "How dare you!" she shrieked. "Shut your stupid mouth. Nathaniel wouldn't hurt a fly. He's mine. I love him. He loves me." "Jennet!" shouted Miss Weathers in horror. "What are you saying?" Nelda stared at Jennet with understanding. "She cannot help it," she told Ben. "The Crozier man controls her now. She is his creature." "No," the boy whimpered. "She can't be." Nelda hurried to the door. "We must leave," she urged. "This place is not safe, for your sister will betray us to him." Ben squirmed away from Jennet and hurried to the parlour. "Benjamin," Miss Weathers cried, "where are you going? Come back." Jennet snarled and leapt after him, dragging him back by the hair. "Oh, no, little brother," she yelled. "If my Nathaniel wants your piece of junk, then I'll see he gets it." She snatched the Guardian from his grasp. At this, Nelda flew at her. With a surprised wail, Jennet felt an invisible fist punch her stomach, and she doubled over. Miss Weathers screamed in fright. "The girl's possessed! Benjamin, phone for the vicar!" "Are you hurt, Jen?" said Ben. The girl only growled at him. "We must go," Nelda pleaded. "We must." Her voice faltered as her keen ears heard something. Then they all heard it. Outside, ringing over the concrete of the yard, came the sound of quick footsteps. "We're too late," breathed Nelda. "It's him," Ben cried. "He's come for the final Guardian. He'll destroy everything." From the hallway they heard the latch rattling. "He's trying to get in," breathed Miss Weathers in terror. The lock clicked and the footsteps strode into the hall. "Nathaniel," mouthed Jennet feverishly. The others huddled into the corner of the room. Nathaniel Crozier, high priest of the Black Sceptre, whose very name was a curse, and whose own hands had butchered many, had come for them. Quickly the Aufwader reached for something to throw, but she was stopped by a commanding voice which cut through the air like a razor. "What on earth have we here?" it demanded. The face of Alice Boston peered round the door in bemused astonishment. The others gazed at her, dumbfounded, then rushed over, wrapping their arms tightly about her. "Goodness!" she exclaimed. "I leave Whitby for a few days and all hell breaks loose." She squinted down at Nelda, who, to her eyes, was slightly blurred. "You needn't tell me who's behind it all either," she added. "That I already know." Only Jennet hung back. It was Nathaniel she wanted. Nothing and nobody else was important to her now. Brushing past the others, she ran to the hall. "Jennet!" Miss Boston's voice came to her. The girl whirled round. "What have you done with him, you old witch?" she screamed. Miss Boston flinched, and raising her hand, she made a curious sign in the air. "Jennet, stop in the name of all that is holy. Listen to me." "No," Jennet whined as her mind cleared a little. Then the girl fell senseless to the ground. "Will Jen be okay?" Ben asked. "What did you do?" "Merely called for help," replied Aunt Alice. "Don't worry, she's just fainted. If only I had come back sooner. Still, I should be thankful I'm here at all. Praise be for drunken butlers is all I can say." The others stared at her, not understanding a word. The memory of Judith Deacon's body lying broken on the marble floor and surrounded by the fragments of a port bottle reared before her again. Standing by the door, Nelda was impatient to leave. "The guardian must be taken from here," she insisted. "May I see it?" Miss Boston asked. The Aufwader showed Miss Boston the jet serpent, and the old lady studied it with a scowl. "I cannot allow this to continue," she stormed. "This appalling man must be stopped." "But you can't," Ben protested. "He's too powerful." "Have faith," she told him, tucking the guardian into her blouse. "He must have some weakness, or he wouldn't have sent me all the way to London. Besides, I have one or two little surprises left." Miss Boston swept a tweed cloak about her shoulders. "Edith, you stay with Jennet. Ben and Nelda come with me." "Take care, Alice," Miss Weathers called as they disappeared into the mist. The postmistress buried her face in her hands, failing to notice that Jennet was beginning to stir, a hellish light welling up behind her eyelids. Tar gazed about him. It had been a difficult task rounding up those who had fled from the fish demon. Now he stood awkwardly on the sand. "It is finished," he muttered. "Everything is ended." Over the sands charged Miss Boston, her cloak flapping. At her side were Ben and Nelda, and the young Aufwader ran ahead to hug her grandfather. "Mr. Shrimp," Aunt Alice cried somberly, "take your people away from here. Lead them into the town. The shore is too dangerous." She pointed to the sea, and there on the outermost spur of the east pier stood a solitary figure. "A storm is coming," warned the old lady. "The worst there has ever been." "Deeps take me," muttered Tar. Calling to the rest of the tribe, he cried, "Follow me! We will clear out of here and seek shelter in the town of the land folk." Tar was their leader now, and he started shepherding them along the shore towards the town. "And you go with them, Benjamin," Aunt Alice told him. "No," the boy cried. "I won't leave you." Nelda took hold of Ben's hand. "Come," she said. "Your aunt is right. We have done our part." The old lady smiled at her gratefully. "You see," she murmured, "it's up to me now." She bent down and kissed Ben. "Goodbye, Benjamin," she said. "Take him away from here, Nelda, dear." And Nelda pulled him towards the town. The sea was angry now, and violent waves crashed against the square stones of the pier, lashing the full might of its rage upon them in a frenzy of destruction. Through battering walls of stinging spray Miss Boston struggled. Not far now, she could see the small lighthouse at the end of the pier, and before it, Nathaniel. The Warlock crowed triumphantly, leaning into the growing storm and defying it with his laughter. Turning his head, his dark gaze fell upon Miss Boston as she tottered towards him. "The end has come," he cried. "Even though one guardian still remains, the enchanted sleep is over." Aunt Alice grasped the rail as the sea burst over the side. "You revolting creature!" she shouted. "You killed Patricia!" "Don't forget that old fool Roper," he interrupted with a vile chuckle. "Ernest," she cried. "Him too." But the Warlock had turned back. In an arrogant sweep of his arm he encompassed the darkness that was Whitby. "The whole town," he gradually announced, "was founded and built on the back of Morgaurus, a serpent so huge that it can swallow the contents of the entire harbour in one vast gulp." "And you've woken this unclean spirit?" "How else could I dominate and control it?" he cried. Miss Boston stared at the boiling surface of the waves. "But surely," she cried, "if it leaves the underground caverns, Whitby will be utterly destroyed." Nathaniel did not answer, for at that moment the sea exploded and the monstrous head of Morgaurus burst from the raven deep. It was massive, encrusted by barnacles and the reeking scum of millennia. A deafening screech issued from 3 huge nostrils as Morgaurus breathed. The fetid apparition reared, towering far into the sky, the 5 tortured horns raking the clouds and tearing the canopy of the world. The Warlock raised his arms to begin his evil work. "Now," he cried, "while the drowse still lies heavy on it, I seize my chance." He clenched his teeth and summoned the dark forces at his command. "Aid me," he ordered. "Give me the strength to conquer and control." The air about his fingertips shimmered, and a livid green flame flickered into existence. High above, the vast head opened its ravening maw, and a hollow cry bellowed from the dark throat. The noise rent the heavens, buildings toppled, and huge chunks of the cliffs crumbled into the sea. Tears streamed from Nathaniel's eyes as he quaked under the strain of his exertions. "No!" yelled Nathaniel, and he threw back his hands. At once, the spitting flames leapt from his fingers and bolted upward, striking the ghastly head. The Warlock's spells crackled furiously over the serpent, and though the beast tried to pull away, the dazzling flames held it securely. "Creature of the primeval dawn," Nathaniel proclaimed, "hear me!" The head shuddered, trying to escape the terrible forces which gripped it. "You will be mine," the Warlock commanded. "You have no will of your own. Obey my words. Obey me." The serpent froze, and Nathaniel's voice finally cut through into its mind. The brain of the creature was vast, yet the countless years of sleep had made it sluggish, and his quick mind sliced through like a keen blade. The contest was his. Her white hair plastered down by slime and frightful ooze, Miss Boston finally took a grip on herself. "What's the matter with you, Alice?" she cried. "Get up there and stop that foul man." "Stop!" she yelled, grabbing the man's arm and dragging him away. Nathaniel shrieked. His concentration was broken, and the mental link between him and the monster snapped momentarily. Miss Boston threw herself at him, pummeling and kicking, and Nathaniel staggered under the ferocity of the old lady's attack. "Whitby can wait," he growled. "It's you who'll die first, but it's a pleasure I'll undertake myself." "No!" she wailed as his strong fingers closed about her neck. "Look your last on this world, old woman," he snarled. A darkness greater than that which had already engulfed Whitby closed about her, and the old lady's hands fell limply to her sides. "Nathaniel!" came an urgent voice. "Nathaniel!" Jennet hurled herself forward to greet him, but her stride faltered. The head of Morgaurus loomed monstrously up out of the mist, and the girl cried out. But the creature still seemed to be in the grip of Crozier's influence. Jennet cautiously edged into the beast's great shadow, her obsession with the man driving her through the danger. The Warlock was crouching over the body of Aunt Alice, his hands tight about her throat. Jennet stared incredulously at him. The horrible dark eyes cut right through her. "Will you never stop pestering me, you boring child?" he spat. "Shall I throttle you as well?" It was as if a veil were torn from Jennet's eyes. "Don't you touch me!" she screamed. "How fickle is woman," Nathaniel growled, stealing closer. The girl fell back, and the Warlock reached out for her. "Don't you dare!" came a croaking voice. Jennet grinned with joy. "Aunt Alice," gasped Jennet. "I thought you were dead." "For a minute back there, so did I," muttered the old lady. Then she glared angrily at Nathaniel. "I suppose I should be grateful for your slipshod incompetence," she shouted. "It seems you can't do anything right. Look behind you." "Tiny insects," Morgauris spoke, the forbidding sounds echoing inside each of their heads. "What paltry webs do they spin?" The Warlock threw his arms open. "Remember," he roared, "you are mine to command." Terrible laughter cut deeply into the three small figures as the serpent reared up. "Thou mayest have wakened me, little man, but I shall not trade one set of bonds for another. Now are my wits restored, and thy powers are as nothing compared to mine." Nathaniel was incensed. Screeching, he put forth his powers, yet every furious volley of enchantment broke against the unassailable might of the gigantic serpent. "A futile display," Morgauris mocked. "You have lost, little man." Thanks to the delay Miss Boston had caused, the creature had been given enough time to shake off the lingering traces of sleep. All Crozier's glorious dreams were in ruins, and his life was forfeit. The tremendous jaws of his nemesis gaped open, and a gale of putrid breath screeched all around the terrified man. "Ah!" howled Nathaniel as the poisonous fumes blasted into him. All over his body the skin crackled and solidified, turning a dull, chalky grey. Racked in torturous agony, the Warlock perished, and only a solid figure of stone stood where he had been. Then the victorious serpent shook its head, and at the sound of its laughter, the statue of Nathaniel trembled and shattered. Aunt Alice tried to comfort the child at her side. Then the disgusting head swung round to them. "More of the human kind," the frightful voice echoed in their heads. "I shall not rest again till all traces of their infestations have been scorched from the land." Miss Boston staggered to her feet and pushed Jennet behind her. "Return to your slumbers," she demanded. "Begone, and sleep till man's time is over, and you can roam the oceans free of hindrance. I defy you, Morgauris. Leave now, before you anger me." Her insolence enraged the terrible creature. "Thou art lice," it roared, "and I shall crush thee." Miss Boston took from her blouse the last guardian. As the jaws approached, she called beseechingly into the night and held the guardian out before her. "Hear me, O lords of the deep and dark," she cried. "Renew the strength of the enchantment you laid upon the enemy many ages ago. I plead to you, goddess of the moon, instill this device with your strength." Morgaurus's fangs came ravaging for her. "Lord God in heaven," she prayed, "defend us from this foulness." She lifted the carving above her head. "All three powers work as one at last," she shouted. A deep rumble resounded through the night. On the horizon, beneath the line of the sea, a golden radiance welled through a tear in the clouds. The disk of the moon shone, and upon the cliff the abbey gleamed white and cold. In Miss Boston's hands, the eyelids of the jet carving sprang open, and a brilliant light shone from the crystals behind them. "No!" the serpent screamed. "The light! It blinds!" Miss Boston's arms trembled. The forces that were pouring from the carving were staggering. The glittering light raged about the monster's head. A terrible fatigue set into the sinews of its coils, numbing the nerves and turning the black blood to ice. The serpent fought to dispel the numbness which ate into its putrid flesh, but the manacles of sleep tightened all the more. From the churning waves, a host of white sparks shot into the air, and Morgaurus shrieked as titanic forces began to drag it under. "I shall escape," the serpent cried. "Enchantments fail. The guardian may be broken." Miss Boston sobbed as the carving burned into her palms, and she shook uncontrollably as the great dark eyes slid beneath the sea. And still the guardian poured out its banishing rays, lighting up the sea for miles around. Under the cliffs, Morgaurus was compelled to return to the caverns of its ancient prison. Trouble the world. No more, the old lady commanded. Smoke streamed from her hands as the guardian scorched her skin. No longer was it a carving of jet, but a divine thing of purity. Jennet pulled at Miss Boston's cloak. "Make it stop," she cried. "The creature's gone." But the old lady couldn't. The carving continued to shine, and the splendor of its glory was destroying her. Jennet snatched the guardian from the old lady's grasp. Miss Boston wailed and fell back, her palms smoking hideously. Jennet threw herself to the old lady's side. "Aunt Alice," she sobbed. "Aunt Alice." Miss Boston feebly moved her head. "Jennet," she uttered thickly. "Is it over?" "Yes," she replied, her own tears splashing on the old lady's face. A faint smile flickered about Miss Boston's mouth. Be a good girl, dear," she murmured. "Take care of Benjamin." And her eyes slowly closed. A pale glimmer rose about them. The unnatural night was lifting, and the day stole over the town once more. As the day star sparkled over the waves, the light of Earl's guardian dimmed, and the eyelids closed over the crystals. The device became jet once more. The invocations that Earl had never been able to utter had finally been completed by Miss Boston. The danger was over, but she had paid dearly for the safety of all. On a cold January morning, an ambulance trundled over the repaired cobbles of the East Cliff and drew up at the end of Church Street. A severe stroke, the doctors had called it, yet it was more than that. To save the world from Morgaurus, Miss Boston sacrificed herself. But fate had decreed that she should not die. Instead, the old lady was a pale reflection of who she had been. Her 92 years had descended heavily upon her. Arthritis crippled her hands, and her legs were brittle stalks. Although the doctors assured her that she would regain her voice given time, at present she could only mumble unintelligibly. Muffled and swathed like a babe, the ambulance man wheeled her through the alleyway and into the yard beyond. All her friends were there to welcome her home. Standing by the door of the cottage were Jennet and Ben, and they rushed to greet the old lady. Behind the children scurried Edith Weathers. "It's lovely to see you back again," whispered Jennet into Aunt Alice's ear. Ben took her hand and kissed it gently. "Don't worry," he whispered. "It'll be fine. Me and Jen won't let Miss Weathers treat you like a baby." Giving her a warm grin, he then added, "And tonight, I've got a surprise for you." The last of the fireworks shot into the sky, bursting with flowers of red and orange fire. The small group who'd been watching applauded. It had been a splendid display. "Lovely," twittered Miss Weathers. "But I still think you should have lit them, Jennet." The girl gazed down at her brother on the shore. "No," she replied. "They were Ben's way of celebrating Aunt Alice's return. And I think they had a private meaning for him as well." On the sands, Ben stared into the dark heavens. "Goodbye, Mr. Roper," he said. Miss Boston gazed at the boy on the shore, aching to thank him. "Ben!" Jennet called. "We're going in now." "Coming," he answered, running over the beach to join her. Nelda stared after the children until they disappeared into the narrow streets. She had desperately wanted to talk with Ben, but something had prevented her from calling to him. The surviving fisherfolk had moved back into the few dismal caves that had not been destroyed, and now they lived a hard life in cramped and wretched conditions. The guardian of Earl was entrusted to Nelda's grandfather, and he had been elected as the new leader of them all. Now Nelda stared at the icy stars. The time was coming when she must tell. She could not keep her terrible secret. Gazing into the black darkness, Nelda wept. Her doom was certain, for inside the young Aufwader, a child was growing. And that's the end of the second part of the Whitby trilogy.